Cool Figure TV. Revolutionary salute. Revolutionary salute. Like, share, subscribe. Welcome to the House of Revolution. You know I'm your humble host, D.E.I. of Revolution. We got a World War III alert. But before we get into that, y'all be sure to wipe y'all feet. Hit the like button. You in the House of Revolution. Like, share, subscribe, support the platform, y'all. Well, I'm the hardest working revolutionary in the news. Business is back. Let's get right to the information tonight. Salute.
The Khatam al-Anbiya central headquarters of IRGC denied the claims on Thursday, stating that Donald Trump's baseless claims about normal ship traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, which reflect the desperation and helplessness of the U.S. armed forces, are nothing but fabricated lies and falsehoods, said spokesperson Lieutenant Colonel Ibrahim Zulfikari. Trump had just dismissed the previous day's narrative regarding the Strait of Hormuz agreement, stating that the U.S. had total control over the Strait of Hormuz, and referring to the naval blockade as the Iron Wall. Nevertheless, traffic through the Strait of Hormuz remained limited on Wednesday, with 14 confirmed crossings, most of which were conducted under Iranian unilateral scheme.
I don't trust Iran. Why? Are you saying I trust Iran? I'm the last person to trust Iran. They've lied to me constantly. We have total control over the Hormuz Strait right now. They don't have control. We have total control. We own it. And at some point, maybe they'll do something and then they get blown away. But right now, we're in a very good position. We have a country that has been the bully of the Middle East for 50 years. It's really 51 if you think about it, right? We've been saying 47 for 4 years. And they're no longer the bully of the Middle East. Thank you very much, everybody.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحیم. ادعاهای واهی آمریکا مبنی بر عبور و مرور عادی شناورها از تنگه هرمز که نشان از استیصال و درماندگی ارتش آن کشور است، کذب و دروغی بیش نیست. اعلام می‌گردد تنگه هرمز همچون گذشته تحت مدیریت کامل و کنترل جمهوری اسلامی ایران میباشد و هیچ کشتی تجاری و نفتکشی بدون مجوز و نظارت نیروهای مسلح مقتدر ایران امکان تردد امن از این تنگه را نداشته و نخواهند داشت. سران و ارتش تروریست آمریکا از گذشته تا کنون اقتدار و ایستادگی ملت و فرزندان شجاع مردم در نیروهای مسلح قدرتمند ایران را به خوبی آزمودند. آمریکا به طور مداوم به دنبال شرارت و ناامنی در منطقه است و تهدیدهای بدون پشتوانه و بی اساس آن کشور در مقابل آمادگی‌های همه جانبه و بیش از گذشته رزمندگان قهرمان اسلام در نیروهای مسلح نتیجه‌ای جز بیچارگی و درماندگی بیشتر برای آنها نخواهد داشت. نیروهای مسلح پر افتخار ایران اسلامی تمام تحرکات دشمنان آمریکایی صهیونیستی را در منطقه زیر نظر دارند و تحت فرماندهی حکیمانه و هوشمندانه فرمانده معظم کل قوا حضرت آیت الله سید مجتبی خامنه‌ای مدظله العالی در تحقق حقوق ملت، حاکمیت ملی و دفاع از آرمان‌های انقلاب اسلامی و کشور عزیزمان ایران ذره‌ای تردید نداشته و نخواهند داشت و به هر گونه تهدید در هر نوع و هر سطح پاسخ کوبنده‌تر و شدیدتر از قبل خواهند داد و من نصر الا من عند الله العزیز الحکیم.
against President Trump in Ankara. So the report was the New York Times said he changed Air Force Ones because of a security threat. And it came from Israeli sources, so take it with a grain of salt. And then funny enough, Barak Ravid from Axios, a kilo of salt. And then Barak Ravid from Axios said that there was no credible threat or plans by Iran to conduct an assassination attempt against Trump, but there were just talks among leadership, which I think that would be the case. I'm sure different leaders would talk about that possibility. And then we got information in the last couple of days that Trump was actually sneaked off of Air Force One with 3 of his advisors, without Marco Rubio, without anyone else who remained on Air Force Ones, onto another aircraft, not an Air Force One. Because there was, according to a report today from the Wall Street Journal, the threat was some militants. So it's not a plan by Iran, but some militants had a plan or discussions about firing a missile, for a shoulder-based missile onto Trump's Air Force One when he was taking off in Ankara. But according to the same report that came out today, some U.S. officials considered the alleged plot implausible since there was no evidence the suspected militants possessed the necessary missile system in Ankara, while Turkish officials later said that they found no evidence Trump had been in danger. But despite those doubts, the Secret Service did sneak him on a catering truck off of Air Force One onto another aircraft. Now, my position is I'm sure many people in Iran would like to see Trump killed after what happened to their country. Some of them may even advocate for the assassination of President Trump. But from what I've seen so far, I don't think Iran's leadership has any serious plans to kill the president, because it does not advance Iranian interests in any way. It's more vengeance rather than a pragmatic strategic step to achieve certain objectives. So that's my position. But I would love to get your thoughts on whether you think there could be discussions like this about potentially targeting Trump, whether now or in the future.
Well, you said that Axios said that among the leadership in Iran, they were discussing it.
That was from a couple of weeks ago. That was right after the Ankara summit. But something along those lines, either leadership or officials. I think it was officials. So when I say officials, it could be just members of parliament, which there's like 200-300 of them, I think.
Yeah, because there's no doubt that the Israelis have no access to what the high-ranking people in Iran say. There's way too much security for that. And the Iranians are much too smart for the Israelis or the Americans when it comes to these issues. One of the things about the Iranians is that they put so much information out there that the Israelis and Americans are often at a loss as to what is right and what is wrong. One of the things about Iranian intelligence that I know of a bit is that when the U.S. embassy was taken, because the United States supported the Shah, they helped the Shah impose a police regime, a police state for 2.5 decades. And then, of course, during the revolution, the Shah used his army to gun down people for many months, but ultimately fell. And the U.S. embassy from the very beginning was working to overthrow the state. They gave refuge to the Shah, the United States, and then the embassy was working with remnants of the previous regime, the military, to do a coup, with separatist groups to create armed insurrection, terror organizations, militant groups in Tehran and other cities to create unrest. The U.S. embassy was the center of a conspiracy against the new Islamic Republic. And that's why the students took the embassy, because they were afraid of a repeat of 1953, the US-British coup back then. But regardless of what happened after the embassy takeover, one of the things that happened was they took all the information, the secret information that the CIA had in the embassy, and they began to publish them and read them and publish them, and then those documents that were shredded, they put them all together, and it was like 50 or 60 books. And so a lot of these students, later on, they joined the intelligence, and they some of them became the initial, let's say, group that ran Iranian intelligence, and they had already learned a lot about how the United States functions and how the U.S. intelligence agency, the CIA, how it functions. So what they would do is that they would send a lot of Iranians, who some of them worked for the Shah's regime. Some of them were people who were about to retire from the army, and a lot of them like just not religious people who could convince the CIA that they were with them. So they would send these people to U.S. embassies abroad to offer themselves to cooperate with the CIA. And apparently, a lot of these double agents, a lot of these people became double agents for the 1980s and the 1990s, and they misled the CIA a great deal during those 2 decades. I don't know about afterwards, but I knew a thing or two about what was going on back then, later on, but I don't know what they do now.
You knew a thing or two. Were you one of them, Professor?
Me? I was, when I was 16, I volunteered to fight in the war. And I've never, I've only lived abroad. I've only lived abroad from 1999 to 2003, 3.5 years doing my PhD in Birmingham. So nothing much goes on in Birmingham, but in the UK. I mean, I'm not to disrespect the city, the people of Birmingham, but it's not. I don't think it's the center of intelligence gathering.
It's not Brussels, that's for sure.
Yeah, and so in any case, So in the 1980s, the early 1980s, I was either at school or at university, or I was in the war fronts as a volunteer. And I survived 2 chemical attacks. So whenever I hear Americans or Europeans talk about human rights, I break out. What they say, I break out in a rash. It's like, really, the Americans and the Europeans and human rights. Nowadays people appreciate it more because of Gaza, because of the war on Iran, because of Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Venezuela, Cuba. But back then, it was, surviving chemical weapons was a horrifying thing. And of course, the irony is that the Germans did more than anyone else to provide Saddam Hussein with those chemical weapons. And of course, ironically, they overthrew Saddam Hussein in the name of those very same chemical weapons that they gave to him to use against people like me. Anyway, that's a different story. So the U.S. intelligence on Iran has never been very good. And the same is with Mossad. I think Mossad and the United States create this aura of invincibility and that they know it all, and the Iranians like to play with that a lot. And the Iranians they played with them quite effectively. And as we see with the military, I mean, if the Israeli regime and the Americans had so much intelligence on Iran, they wouldn't have carried out these 2 catastrophic wars. They would have known what exists in Iran's underground missile cities, what exists in Iran's underground drone cities. They have no clue about what the capabilities of the country really are. So,
just on that one, I want to say, my counterpoint to you was, I think you're dismissing their capabilities. And look what they did. The Hamas leader, for example, when he was in Iran, they knew which hotel room they planted a device. Also, all the leadership in Iran, which we're going to talk about, the leadership who replaced him recently, who was appointed by Mustafa Khamenei. But the leadership that was targeted and assassinated, other than the supreme leader who was in his home, other leaders were targeted throughout the war. But your counterpoint it wasn't meant as a counterpoint, but the point you made about not knowing how the war will turn out, but also Iran's missile capabilities and the ability to fire missiles, fire drones. Trump saying he was surprised that they fired at the Gulf kind of makes your point that maybe the intelligence was good and the U.S. was misled, but then the U.S. Trump was misled by the intelligence community intentionally, or the intelligence community genuinely had false intelligence and expected the war to go differently.
Well, there's talk of deceit and deception and deceiving the American people nowadays. But I don't think targeting Iranian leaders was a great intelligence coup. Ayatollah Khamenei was in his office, and there's nothing extraordinary about that. And the other leaders, I mean, the United States is the only regime in the contemporary world that assassinates leaders and targets, so the Americans and the Israelis, what they do is that they bomb apartment blocks, kill everyone inside so that they can get one person. I guess the Iranians underestimated the barbarism of the U.S. military and of course, the similarities that exist between the United States and the Israeli regime. What the Israelis do in Lebanon and Gaza, the United States does too. Perhaps that was that they underestimated. But except for the first couple of days, as we move forward, they didn't. The assassination attempts became less and less effective, and ultimately, the Iranians defeated them. They've defeated the combined force of the United States, the Israeli regime, and those proxies in the Persian Gulf that facilitated this war. And by the way, these regimes in the Persian Gulf that were part of the war, not only did they provide space, but I'm sure you know that those bases, they pay for the U.S. presence in these bases. It's not as if all costs are paid for by the Americans. No, they subsidize. They do more than subsidize. They pay for a lot of what goes on in these bases. So they shoulder a lot of the financial burden of the wars against Iran, and they helped us, both the Americans and the Israeli regime, because the refueling planes that would fly, they would both American refueling planes. They would refuel both American planes, but also Israeli planes in the war. So these countries were effectively in coalition with the Israelis and Americans in assaulting Iran. And I've always said that Iran should demand reparations from each and every one of these countries. But anyway, so
there were reports from Iran today that the Emiratis have been delivering billions of dollars and gold to Iran. There was a report today. I saved it. It came out just not long ago, but that's from Iranian sources. The UAE has released several $1 billion of Iran's frozen assets held in in Emirati banks, including 2 tons of gold worth $283 million, with the goal being that Iran spares the United Arab Emirates from future attacks, according to multiple senior sources in Tehran with knowledge of the transfers. The assets were flown to Iran aboard a Boeing 737, blah, 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 operated by who, blah, blah, blah. And
who said this?
Oh, you didn't see that? That came from Iranian sources.
No, which news agency said that?
Not one of the major. I wanted to say this. It's not a major news outlet. These are not a major Iranian news outlets or Western news outlets. But there's been multiple Olsen accounts pointing at a lot of Emirati jets flying to Iran for an hour or two and then flying back. And even today, they fly for 1 hour and then they return. They fly for 1 hour and then they return. And there's been rumors about the UAE delivering a lot of money to Iran for a while. And for me, I'm not surprised. I've been saying this could happen for a while because the Emiratis, they've done business with Iran for a long time and they need stability. Their whole model depends on stability. We've discussed this a while ago. So I'm not saying this is true. This is all unconfirmed, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Even if this were true, which I can't confirm, but these are not reparations. According to this report, these are stolen Iranian assets. So returning stolen assets is not a favor. It's like me stealing your car and then returning it to you, and you thank me for the car.
It's a bit different. These are sanctions imposed by the US and the Western world. That the Emirates should abide by those sanctions. For the Emirates to unfreeze assets, there must be a deal done with the US as well to allow them to do that. There must be a lot of things happening behind the scenes. You make a valid point. This is not extra money paid, but I definitely see it as a significant gesture if there's billions that has been unfrozen. That's a lot of money.
Well, we'll have to see. Time will definitely tell. But going back to the initial point that you made, yes, it's clear that overwhelmingly Iranians would like to see Trump killed and executed or put on trial or whatever. And I think the same is true with all those who pulled the trigger and killed, whether in Mina, where they killed all those little children, elementary school kids, mostly girls, or in La Mer, where they bombed on the first day of the war too. They bombed a sports complex, killing a lot of little young women, teenagers who were playing volleyball. And apparently that was an experimental missile, which did pretty good in wiping out those, young teenager girls. But so yeah, I think the Iranians would like us to see a lot of Americans and Israelis executed, pilots and anyone else who was involved. But I don't think the government would be involved in this sort of thing. And I personally think that probably the Israelis made a fool out of Trump. And Trump, of course, what he did was cowardly. No one, all those. I mean, let's assume that the threat was real. Whatever, a group, a militant group, or whoever. All those journalists were allowed to be sacrificial lambs for Trump. I mean, I find that pretty disgusting.
I had one of my guests yesterday, an American guest, got really upset at me because I was bringing up that topic, and I said, I don't advocate. I think if Iran decides to assassinate Trump, I think that doesn't work to the advantage of Iran, because Iran is seen as the victim of a war of aggression. And, as you seek revenge or as you do things like this, it moves the needle away from being a victim more to it was being an aggressor. I'm not saying it suddenly moved from being a victim to an aggressor, but if Iran kills Trump, more of an aggressor, bombs a school, more of an aggressor, declares war on the US, more of an aggressor. And the Iran knows this, and that's why I don't think they'd be trying to kill Trump. So I was making that argument, and I also pointed that I don't advocate for the assassination of Trump, and they got really upset. I said, Mario, that's the way of thinking is not right at all. What the US has the right to kill the supreme leader of Iran, and Iran doesn't have the right to kill the president. And then my counterpoint to that was,
I'm sure the slave owners. I'm sure American slave owners in the 19th century had the same mentality.
So the point that I made, though, is I said, two wrongs doesn't make a right. So I don't think the Iran should kill the president of the United States, whether now or later. The same way Iran, just because their leader was killed, the same way I don't think Iran should bomb a school in the US just because their school is bombed. I think Iran should seek justice. That is their right, and I hope they get justice. I don't think they will. Unfortunately, that's not how the world works. But that was my position. I think from our discussions, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you're in a similar position as I. You don't think Iran should try to assassinate the president of the United States. Is that fair to say?
One thing I would just clarify first, and that if A assassinates B, the leader of B, and B retaliates and assassinates the leader of A, that's retaliation. That's not illegitimate. Doesn't make both sides an aggressor. The side that started it is the aggressor. But in any case, I don't think that Iran is going to put any money or anything like that into such an operation. I think the Iranians have said that Trump deserves this. All those people who murdered Iranians and the children, and the same is true in Gaza and elsewhere, that they are killers and they deserve to be punished and they should be on trial like in Nuremberg. But I don't think that I don't see any evidence that the Iranians have put any funding or any effort into carrying out any form of operation whatsoever. I just believe that's nonsense. And I think that the Israelis, if they pass on that, and I would imagine that the Israeli regime did that they passed on that sort of information to humiliate Trump or to make him fear being assassinated or whatever the agenda is. But again, either the Israelis, their intelligence is awful, which, as I said, they're not nearly as good as they claim to be, as the war has shown. And again,
unless they fed Trump false intelligence, which I'm in that camp.
Yeah, or they fed him false intelligence in this case, or elsewhere. But bombing, let's say, where I live is known. So if the Americans and the Israelis bomb my house, it's not an intelligence coup. everyone in the neighborhood, from the supermarket guy to the hair, the barber shop, they all know where my home is. So, I mean, and the same is true with others. Assassinating Iranians by firing missiles at their apartment buildings is not an intelligence coup. That's just how the United States and the Israeli regime work. They are utterly barbaric. And this is where sometimes, because when you say, like, this is terrible, what's happening to the United States, and the Chinese, or I saw something, you were doing a show with someone about the economy, and I listened in, and you were saying this is terrible, that the United States is falling back. I don't see the United States as morally superior to any country on this planet. In fact, I consider them the most morally inferior, the U.S. government on this planet, after the Israeli regime. I prefer Cuba, North Korea, Venezuela, well, the former Venezuela,
North Korea,
any country to these
that's
two
North
countries.
Korea.
Oh, yes, definitely. North Korea has never used chemical weapons against other nations.
Doesn't mean they wouldn't if they have the capacity.
Yeah, well, I don't know. They haven't done it yet. But North Korea doesn't, rape prisoners to death in prison, and then the rapists are celebrities on TV, and they go on TV shows. Well, the United States supports it, so the values are the same. If God forbid, well, I don't even want to give the example, but if A carries out all sorts of atrocities, and then B, meaning me, aids them in carrying out those atrocities, there's not much difference. I mean, without B, A could never do those things.
I'll tell you my stance. Yeah, I'll tell you my stance. That's a very interesting point, because I've thought about this. I'll tell you my stance is because I could criticize U.S. foreign policy, what the U.S. has done in Iran, what the U.S. has done in Iraq and Afghanistan, in the Middle East, on and on. The support for Israel is probably the thing that upsets me the most. While also, wanting the U.S. or a democracy, I'd say U.S., Europe, etc., to be a superpower or one of the superpowers. The reason is I believe in, I don't want to say Western values, is very broad, but I believe in democratic values. I believe in decentralized power. Now, I know the U.S. is not a perfect democracy, but the argument
it's not a democracy.
Not a democracy. But I just want to explain the argument of, like, okay, but then does that mean I advocate for what the U.S. is doing? My worry is, if we move to a world where China being the superpower, the hegemon, or a unipolar world, and that world is more peaceful, then I would advocate for that. I would advocate, because I'm against war. But my worry is, when a country has the amount of power that the US has, if you look throughout history, whenever there's a hegemon, whenever a country has unchecked power, it tends to abuse it. And I think this is not an American problem. This is not a British problem. This is not a Japanese problem when it had the Japanese Empire. This is an Ottoman problem. None of these problems. It's a human problem. And I just believe that whenever there's a hegemon, whatever that country is, even if it's Iran, even if it's South Korea, even if it's Spain, think of the most peaceful country, China. China is a non-interventionist. But I think if China does become the hegemon, eventually, the same way the US has changed from the 1940s to where we are today, that same thing could apply for China. I could be wrong, but I think the issues we're talking about are more issues of human nature rather than issues of Iran or the US or China or Japan.
Well, I think that's a long debate that we could have, but I believe that the Western empires over the last few hundred years, they're the ones that have devastated the world, and they've destroyed China, among other places, the Opium Wars, or for example, Churchill, who's celebrated often in the West. I mean, he was deeply racist, and he used chemical weapons in Iraq, and he was, you should read the language that he uses about Indians, and so on. So
it's disgusting.
So I don't consider, I mean, again, when I talk about the West, I'm talking about the elites. I'm not talking about ordinary people who go to work every day. Right now, they're victims like everyone else. Increasingly, I think it's becoming increasingly clear that the empire, the Epstein class, doesn't differentiate between little girls in the United States or little girls in Gaza. But But in any case, I do think there's a difference in values. I think in the case of Iran, contrary to what you may think, and again, I remind you to go and read that book, Going to Tehran, by the Leverets. It's a good book, and to read Alistair Crook's book, Resistance, to get a better understanding of Iran. Regardless of 47 years of anti-Iranian propaganda by Western media, the reality is the opposite. And I think the events in Gaza show that. The only country that was sincere about opposing the genocide in Gaza was Iran. No one else was sincere. Some gave lip service, but no one paid a price, any price at all, for the people of Gaza, even a little bit. If they did, they'd be punished for it. They'd be sanctioned. They'd be marginalized. They'd be, they'd be hurt. But it's because the values that exist in Iran and the Islamic Republic of Iran, regardless of what they say about it, it cannot tolerate the genocide. And I think I may have said this to you before. It's not just because Palestinians are Muslims. If the Palestinians in Gaza were Jews and in Israel, they were the Muslims, and they were doing this, Iran would be at war with the Muslims. So that's just how the Islamic Republic of Iran is, regardless of how they like to frame it and say that they murdered 6 million people in the riots, and they cut women in half, or they eat children for breakfast and beat up the men for dinner, or whatever, cook the men for dinner, whatever they say. The reality, I think Gaza shows the reality. When you put all the propaganda aside, one side pays the price because they see Palestinians as human beings, and everyone else, all the other countries, and I'm not talking about the people of those countries.
Yeah.
Because we saw millions of people across the world, from Australia to Spain, protesting against
the US, everywhere.
The genocide. Yeah, everywhere. I'm in general.
Yeah, I was smiling because I was like, Iran International will now clip you saying, Professor Morandi admits to eating children during the riots.
Yeah, the Iran International would do that. Yeah,
dolphins with bombs. The point you've made about the elites. If we go, because I was in Rwanda, I learned about that genocide. I was in former Yugoslavia. I've learned the genocide there, Turkish genocide on the Armenians. It's happened throughout history. By pretty much every country has a dark history. So that's why I put it on human nature rather than one country's better than other. And that's, for me, I say the same thing to someone who's painting Iran as that evil regime that eats children for breakfast. So I say the same thing there, the perception that was created in the West. And I've learned a lot.
The Iranians are the good guys.
I hate putting.
If it was 50 years ago in the Shah's regime, I wouldn't say this. Back then, the Shah, he collaborated with the United States. He even helped in Vietnam. He provided apartheid South Africa with oil. He provided the Israeli regime with oil. But that was, so I'm not talking about like this land, this territory, this geography is different, but from everywhere else. No, 50 years ago, we had a regime here that was collaborating with empire. It was a proxy of the United States, and it was being plundered just like these Arab regimes in the Persian Gulf right now, they have the war against Iran and the war against Yemen, I think, proved that all this oil wealth and gas wealth, it provided the people of these countries with nothing. They spend trillions of dollars on weapons, but they can't even fight. And the Shah's regime was just like them. They paid huge amounts of money. They exported huge amounts of oil. They brought in tens of thousands of American advisors who basically ran the army and the armed forces. And the Iranians weren't even allowed to, like, for example, Iran bought 4 F-14s when it was a new jet. And but the Iranian engineers were not allowed to look into the machinery. They weren't allowed to repair it or open it up. The Americans had to do it. So you owned it, but you couldn't touch it. Why? Because you paid for it. You helped the U.S. industry, but at the end of the day, if they wanted they wouldn't let you learn anything about the technology. And if they walked away, which they did, then you couldn't fly the plane because you couldn't repair it. So, the Iran under the Shah was the same, and it's just as bad as the others. But now that's not the case, and that's why they hate Iran so much. Again, you bought the book, but go read it. And go buy Alice's book and read that too.
I will. Last point on that front, because you said Iran is the good guys. I think you know my position. I don't look at things as good and bad. And the reason I'm highlighting this, because literally about an hour ago, I saw a quote by Hexeth. He said it earlier today. He was in the Panamanian jungle. He said, "Today we launched the motto of the ACCC, which is, quote, we do bad things to bad people." I remember reading this and I'm like, I wanted to tweet it, but I didn't. I probably should have. I hate the labeling of good and bad, because when you simplify something as this is bad, it justifies doing horrible things to these people. It's like the Israelis looking at Palestinians. Those are bad people,
but
dehumanizing them.
You don't do horrible things to bad people. You carry out justice. But,
but if you label someone as...
the thing is that if you don't label the Israelis as bad and the Palestinians as their victims, if you don't label apartheid South Africa as bad and the indigenous population as the victims, and so on, then there's no reason for resistance.
I would label the action itself. I would label the action itself.
Nothing can be condemned. If we can't say that you're good and I'm bad, if we just say, well, we're just two people, then whatever I do to you, regardless of how unfair it is and how unjust it is, there's no reason for me to be condemned, because it's neither here nor there. It's neither good nor bad. So there are values. There's no doubt. What happens?
I would condemn the action, Professor, not the person. I wouldn't. For example, the West labels Iran as bad. So that means anything to hurt Iran is justified.
And I'm against that. The thing is that as long as they're in control of the narrative, they're good, and we're bad. When they lose control of the narrative, then it's no one is good and no one is bad. I don't see it that way. I think that there's good and there's bad. I'm not saying that Iran is a utopia. I'm not saying Iran is a every time this, what's his name, Pierce, your country, like some guy is standing beside me with a gun, and I'm saying, oh no, this is a fantastic country or whatever. I could criticize Iran for hours, but when I'm confronting a global audience, or a regional audience, or a national audience, or any audience, when all they hear about Iran is horrible things, I'm not going to badmouth Iran with that little amount of time that I have to respond to the accusations made by usually the empire, which is in my opinion, the manifestation of evil. So, if Piers Morgan stands aside and gives me his show for a month, yeah, I'll spend 15 minutes a day criticizing Iran, and I'll defend it for the 45 other minutes. But if he's going to give me 5-10 minutes every 3 months, no, I'm going to defend Iran to the hilt. Because Iran, they're the good guys. The Axis of Resistance, they're the good guys. The Lebanese Hezbollah, they're the ones who sacrificed to stop the genocide in Gaza. So the same is true with Yemen. Who else did that? No one, except for ordinary people. Ordinary people, Jews, Christians, Muslims, people in the United States lost their jobs. In Europe, they get punished for saying the wrong thing about the genocide. They're heroes across the world, but I'm talking about states. I'm talking about broader institutions, not about ordinary people.
For me, I agree with you. I think there's good and bad. I just like to look at it more as this is a good thing. So what Iran did in January, I think it's a bad thing, shooting protesters. I know we had a debate on this.
Iran didn't shoot protesters.
If they didn't, then it's not a bad thing.
That was an armed uprising, and it wasn't like protesters were standing in the streets and the police were just gunning them down. Hundreds of police officers
what I said.
were killed. Yeah, hundreds of police officers.
I'm saying,
if what happened to innocent people died, but many of those innocent people, if not almost all of them, I don't know, but many of them were killed by these rioters. They wanted a lot of death. Why? Because this was a conspiracy by the Americans and the Israelis to then justify the war. Because in the 12-day war, they got nowhere. So they created this insurrection. They brought in the weapons. so that they could demonize Iran and legitimize the war. And that's exactly what they did. They said, this is a terrible regime. They kill. They were carrying out a genocide in Gaza. And then suddenly in like one day, the Iranians killed like half as many as those who were bombed day and night in Gaza. And the Iran killed half that number. It's obvious what they're
I
up
don't
to
believe
do.
the number. I agree with you. The point I wanted to make is that whatever a country X, it could do something bad, it could do something good. I criticize a specific action, which I think you agree with the concept of it. So I want to go to another story that came up today, and that's something very technical to Iranian politics. So I've been meaning to, waiting for us to speak to ask you about it. So Mohsen Rezai replaced Ali Larjani, if I'm not mistaken, as the head of the Supreme.
Ali Larjani was murdered by the Americans and the Israelis. He replaced
someone replaced Ali Larjani, and he replaced that person, correct?
That's right.
Correct. Yeah. So he's in the position now. So Mohsen Rezai is now the head of the Supreme National Security Council.
The chair.
Ahmed Vahidi, who's I've spoken to a lot of experts that know Iran well. They say, Mario, if we had to guess who's calling the shots, if it was the person with the most power, most people would point to Ahmed Vahidi, even though there's multiple people with a lot of power, and that's other than the supreme leader. And I'd let you expand on that because I'm not an expert on that field. But he replaced Pakpour as the IRGC commander. He's been acting as a de facto commander for a while, but he's now officially the IRGC commander. So I want to get your thoughts on these appointments. Also, there's a statement that came from Iranian media that Mujtaba Khamenei, the supreme leader, when he appointed the Ahmed Vahidi as the head of the IRGC, he told him to strengthen the IRGC's capabilities for, quote, maximum deterrence and maintain readiness to carry out, quote, powerful offensive operations against the enemy. And you had yesterday another commander in the IRGC, not the head of the IRGC. He was doing an interview on PBS, I'm sure you saw it, where he said, if this war goes on, we would be targeting, one of our options is to target American interests outside of the region. So my question to you is, how significant are these appointments by the supreme leader, and what do they indicate on how Iran would look like post this war?
Well, this is another thing that is mythologized in the West, and part of it is propaganda that they do for years. Part of it is, I think, in Iran, Iran intentionally misleads Western intelligence agencies. But the reality is that in Iran, it's not the guards that call the shots. The Supreme National Security Council makes the decisions, and the Supreme National Security Council the head of that council is the president. The guards are in it, the regular army is in it, parts of the cabinet are in it. It's in the leader has two representatives. It's in the Constitution. It's clear what role it plays. So if the guards or the regular army or the foreign minister or Dr. Ghalibaf, the Speaker of Parliament, who's in charge of the negotiations right now, if they want to do something, they have to do it within the framework designated by the Supreme National Security Council. And of course, all the decisions of the council must be approved by the leader. So it's not as if like the guards are making decisions here and there, But again, these are Western narratives that will not go away, so it doesn't really bother me that much, at all. In fact, I'm indifferent. But since you ask, I'm saying this. So the authority lies in the Supreme National Security Council, and all different players in the state, or all different heavyweight figures in the state, they are represented in that council, and they make decisions collectively. And of course, are there different views? Of course there are. I mean, anyone who's been to Iran will know that the diversity of opinion expressed in public, whether on the streets or in government, is far greater than anywhere in the Arabian Peninsula, and probably almost anywhere in this region. I'm just saying probably because I don't want to say definitely. I can't say for sure, but you have all sorts of opinions. You on Iranian TV, there was a debate just a few nights ago, which became viral and so on. These things are happening all the time. I personally, since I don't belong to any particular camp, I get attacked by multiple sides. I get attacked by the reformists. I get attacked by what in the West they like to call the hardliners. And it doesn't matter to me because, I say my own opinion, and I'm not in government, and I can't. So when they say a piece of the regime, it's because it's in their anger and rage they say that. But I'm not in government. And I mean, if the government is willing to hire me as the spokesperson, please, I'm here. I'd like to be paid and have a drive or something. But sadly, I don't. I'm not that impressive. So, but the Supreme National Security Council makes those decisions, and you have the different opinions. Then those different opinions will be expressed, but ultimately, what comes out of the Supreme National Security Council and is agreed upon by the leader, that's policy. So if it's to strike a tanker that violates the rules in the Persian Gulf, it's the Supreme National Security Council. It's not like the local commander, whether it's the regular army or the Revolutionary Guards or the commander of the guards. The appointments are important, but they already took place a long time ago. These people were more or less already in charge. Their names were declared. And I think that's important because it shows that Iran is now much more prepared to protect its senior leaders. Iran has been doing a lot in the past few months to protect its people from U.S. and Israeli terror, because again they have no red lines. They'll slaughter everyone in an apartment block to get a person, and sometimes they'll just slaughter everyone in an apartment block and pretend that they wanted to get a person. But anyway, I digress. So.
What do you think would happen if they tried to assassinate Mujtaba Khamenei now? How do you think Iran would retaliate?
I don't think they can. But of course, it would be all-out war. I don't think they can. But what I wanted to say is that Mohsen Reza is a bit different. He, in my opinion, he was chosen because Iran wants to take a more assertive stance, and the Supreme National Security Council is going to take a more assertive stance. So it's not as if first of all.
What do you mean by assertive? Sorry to interrupt. What do you mean by assertive?
Well, we saw the day before the outgoing chair, Mr. Zulqad, he put out a statement giving those conditions, which were in line with the MOU, but they were expanding upon the MOU. So, for example, in the MOU, it says the United States has to force the Israeli regime to leave Lebanon and end the war, and to respect Lebanon's sovereignty. And we must have an end on all the other fronts. In this statement, he goes and says Palestine.
Yeah.
Not even Gaza, Palestine, Yemen, and Iraq. So it doesn't go further than the MOU, but it details the MOU. It is telling the United States that, don't think through negotiations you can water things down. This is what we want.
Is that Rezai that said this?
No, this was actually the day before Mr. Rezai was chosen, although it was already decided before. But when he was going out, he was saying that, look, the person who's replacing me, I agree that we have to take a tougher stance now. And so Mr. Rezai, who's been known for the last few months to take a very strong stance against U.S. aggression, him coming to power has two messages. One is that he's going to be strong in standing up to the U.S. aggression, and whether it's at the negotiating table or on the battlefield. But also, he is a more powerful person. He was the commander of the guards for, I think, I'm not sure, I think 16 years. You could look it up. I can't check now. But he was the person who effectively created the guards. He wasn't the founder, but when he took over, it was like a small organization, and he expanded it during the war, and he created the Air Force and the Navy.
During the Iraq War.
Yes, and also a few years afterwards. And he's been in government positions ever since. He was the economic deputy of Dr. Raisi. He has a PhD in economics. And the Supreme National Security Council isn't just about war and security. It's about foreign policy. It's about economics. It's about cultural issues, social issues. So he is a stronger person and more influential than the previous chair, and that gives the council greater weight because you have to coordinate the president, the head of the judiciary, the speaker of parliament, the armed forces, the foundations that belong to the state, and so on. And so, since he's a heavyweight, for him it is easier to do so. And since he was the head of the guards for so many years, he has the ability to. He knows exactly what the needs of the armed forces are, and he can also work with them much more easily. In fact, the Speaker of Parliament, who is also the chief negotiator, Dr. Ghalibaf, he was one of Dr. Rezai's field commanders during the war. So he was an important field commander, but Mohsen Rezai was his commander.
Interesting. And when the supreme leader tells them to prepare for powerful offensive operations against the enemy, is that, I'm assuming because it comes after telling him to build maximum deterrence, the context there is that create more offensive capabilities to deter future American aggression. That's the objective, correct?
We are not in a ceasefire. So Iran...
Yeah, Iran said this yesterday.
Yeah, we're not in a ceasefire. And Iran is building, it is expanding its underground missile bases, its drone bases. It's building missiles and drones much faster than the Americans are building. The Iranians and the Russians are way ahead of the United States. And so time is not on the side of the Americans. Some people I hear sometimes say that time is on the side of the Americans. It's not. First of all, the global economy is going downhill very fast. And the Americans can pretend that, 50 million barrels of oil are leaving the Persian Gulf every day. I mean, they can say that all they want, but the reality is something quite different. But that aside, militarily speaking, let's look at the facts. When the Iranians first retaliated against the Israeli regime, that was after they assassinated the head of Hamas in Iran, who was in Iran for the inauguration of the President Pezeshkian. The Iranians fired drones and missiles at the Israeli regime, forcing them to use their missile defense capabilities. But then in the second wave of the True Promise 2 operation, the Iranians became much more effective. And then in True Promise 3, the 12-day war, we saw they were more. Then in the 40-day war, where the Americans brought in everything they had, they were even more effective. And then during this 13 days that after the United States Trump himself undermined the MOU, he violated all the articles. I mean, in Western mainstream media, they say it was the Iranians. It's nonsense. The Americans refused to hand over stolen assets. The Americans refused to tell the Israeli regime to stop killing in Lebanon and to leave. All of these are commitments of the United States. The Americans refused to end the sanctions on Iranian oil. They removed it for a few days and they put it back. They continued to threaten Iran. That's a violation. They expanded the sanctions regime, another violation. And then they opened up their own corridor, this is the key, in the Strait of Hormuz, which was a violation of Article 5, which led to ultimately Iran striking 3 tankers, which were violating Article 5, and the Americans used that to attack Iran. But when they attacked Iran during those 13 days, Iran hurt the Americans very badly, even more so than the 40-day war. And then they struck the Iranians after the 13 days. The Iranians struck the Americans and hit them very badly. So as time progresses, it's the Iranian military that's performing better and better, and the American military that's running out of ammunition.
That's my position as well. That's what I've been saying for a while. The war is over. Initially I thought the war won't even happen because militarily it just didn't make sense. It didn't add up. And that's why I knew Trump would walk away when he's talking about wiping out a civilization because of the points you've made right now. But I also, whenever I think I'm believing something, I try to challenge myself. And I was looking at Iran's economy right now. According to Kepler, Vortexa, and UANI, so various organizations, Iran's oil exports have dropped significantly. They fell from 2 million barrels per day before the blockade to now 300,000 barrels per day. That's in May. That was a few months ago. Vortexa had similar numbers, 209,000, not 300,000. UANI even lower. The inflation numbers, they're about 80, 90% inflation, depending on which sources you trust. The rial is at record lows as well. There's other claims, but those cannot be verified. Lines, red lines, etc. Supermarkets running out of products, but those cannot be verified. So I don't know if it's part of the propaganda.
All you have to do is just I'll take pictures of the local supermarket, you name it, and I'll go in there and you'll see if there's a shortage.
That's my assumption. But those ones, actually, we talked about it before. So I also want to, I always remind myself, because I'm in a similar position as you. I just think that Iran is definitely in a much stronger position after winning the war. But the state of Iran's economy, I'm not saying it's going to crumble like different think tanks say, but the economy is also doing pretty badly. So is there also a fair argument that maybe those economic issues could get a lot harder and also pressure Iran, put Iran also in a difficult position, not just the US?
Of course, the economic situation is more difficult. The Americans bombed hospitals, schools, apartment blocks, the Iranian gas industry, petrochemical plants, pharmaceutical factories. And you don't see this in the Western media at all. They won't say this stuff. And that just shows how complicit they are. And of course, when Trump says he'll obliterate Iran, you don't see any MPs in European parliaments writing petitions about this is barbaric, or you don't see The Guardian or Breitbart or I don't know, the BBC or Fox News. None of them are outraged. So, the Western elites are, deception class. Doesn't matter if they're, the BBC or Fox News, doesn't make a difference. But so obviously the economy is hurting. There's a siege. The siege is warfare. It's like, they're waging war against the Iranian people. But the Iranians will outlast the United States. Remember, the last time they imposed a siege was during the 40-day war, or 39 days. I don't know what to call it, 39 or 40 days. Sometimes they call it 39, sometimes 40. I never bothered to count. I should do that one day. During those days, the United States, Trump on day one said unconditional surrender, and he ended accepting the 14-point Iranian plan as the framework for negotiations. And then he imposed a siege, being the untrustworthy person that he is. Remember, there was supposed to be a ceasefire, and then Netanyahu carpet bombed Lebanon to undermine it. And Trump, instead of saying he's violating the ceasefire, said, it's okay. And he bombed all sorts of neighborhoods that were not even friendly to the resistance. But anyway, so, but then he imposed a siege. It went for over 2 months. How did that end? Was the Iranian economy hurting? Of course it was. How did it end, though? It ended with the MOU and the United States giving those concessions. So while the Iranian economy was hurting, the U.S. economy was hurting too. Remember Herbert Hoover and the Great Depression and all that, when Trump was justifying what he did. So obviously things weren't going all that well for him either. So the Iranians are going to be resilient, and they'll remain steadfast. It'll be tough, but they know that this is a war for survival. They know that the other side wants to destroy the country. The United States, on the other hand, it's a war of choice for the Israeli regime. It's not for the American people. They've ignored the interests of the American people. They have no regard for the interests of the American people. They don't care about the American people. They're Israeli firsters. So, and the American people see that. They saw the genocide in Gaza. Now they're seeing that they are not important for the Israeli firsters who are in control. And that's why at least 2/3 of Americans, and now more apparently, are opposed to the war. So Iran will remain steadfast till the United States fails, till Trump fails. There's no other way out of this.
I'm in agreement there. And we're seeing that unfold. The longer the US tries those strategies, the longer it waits, the MOU just gets worse for the US. As you've said, the demands of the Iranians are...
And Mario, keep an eye on China, on Japan, and the Japanese
watch
currency,
it closely,
the bond market, and then also on the other side of the Persian Gulf. Trump was hoping to milk these countries for a couple of trillions of dollars for the stock market, the bond market, for AI in particular. Is that money is non-existent. In fact, what these countries are going to have to do, if things don't get worse, is that they're going to have to start asking the United States to start returning that money in order to rebuild, in order to to prop up the states in the region, the Saudis in particular. The Saudis have spent at least $200-300 billion in the war in Yemen. They spent a lot of money on the line and all those other mega projects that didn't get anywhere. The Saudis are not in an ideal situation. So a lot of the money that was supposed to go to the United States is not going, and it's going to be reversed. So I think that as we move forward in the weeks ahead, things are going to get more difficult, and Iran will remain steadfast. It will be hard. It will be difficult. It is difficult, no doubt, but the Iranians will come out on top.
Professor, good to see you again. Thank you for your time. And
clips, absolutely outstanding. 92% here in France. So we had a sliver of sun on top. It was something to watch. Fantastic. Essential to once again put us back in our infinitesimally stupid position as a race on a race to extinction. Now, Nima, it's good to see the cosmos in action up there, and they don't care about our stupidity. It's always good to have examples from the cosmos to put us back in our place. And I keep this for the eclipse next year. There'll be another one.
I want to bring you back to the stupidity.
As we say in Brazil, when I was in Brazil zillions of years ago, que horror!
Que horror! Exatamente. Mas é a realidade agora, tem que falar sobre isso.
Isso.
A realidade the reality is the stupidity. So let's put them together because we have to talk about. And
for all of you, our audience, in Brazil, people, at least, and Nima knows this very well, living in Brazil, we love to mock everything. The only thing that we don't mock is the loss of the cosmos. Everything else is game for a good joke.
Yeah.
Okay, exactly. Nima, let's get serious. I know you are dying to get serious.
Yeah. Let me, Pepe, start with the current situation between Iran and the United States. It seems that we are witnessing a war of attrition, and the two sides are preparing for. The United States is one, they're mostly focused on the blockade and putting economic pressure on Iranians, maybe bankrupt Iranian. That's at least in the mind of the administration, Trump administration. On the other hand, you see Iran is changing the game by bringing all the fronts in. Right now, they're not talking about Lebanon, Yemen, Lebanon, Palestine, Iraq, Iran, all together. It's not going to be focused on Iran and the United States. This is the game that has changed and solidified by the new head of the Supreme National Security Council of Iran, Mohsen Rezai, which is so important in my opinion. It shows the signs of the seriousness of what was mentioned before he took in power in the Security Council, and about these all fronts together. And you see the United States doubling down. The United States is not just accepting anything that Iran is bringing up. They're doubling down. They're trying to say, we had the problem with Abraham Lincoln, and we've learned moments ago, we've learned that the United States is going to replace Abraham Lincoln with another aircraft carrier, which is George Washington, is going to go there and replace Abraham Lincoln. This is what's going on, Pepe. And I know that you wrote a new piece and you've sent that to me. Here is the title is The New Great Game Revisited. And what are you trying to say about this chaos we're in right now?
Right. Thank you for mentioning Nima, because this is the first essay in a new platform. It's the Substack account of Geopolitics Prime. I support them from the beginning. And they started their Substack page this week. And one of the first essays is this essay, which will be a first among many. I will be coming back to the theme of the new great game and revisiting it. Something that I started doing many years ago when I was still linked to Asia Times in Hong Kong. Many of my long essays during the 2010s, especially, they were evoking the new great game, which at the time was mostly, of course, the United States, Russia, and China more or less on the background. Then it started to become the new great game between the US and the strategic partnership of Russia, China. Now the new great game is the empire, once again, of chaos, lies, plunder, piracy. You can add any other qualification. And the three civilization states, which are pushing for a new system of international relations, and especially originating in the Organization of Eurasia. Russia, China, and of course, Iran. And Iran now is a force power. And who is actually saying that? Practically announcing it as a fact. Mohsen Rezai, who now is the second most important man in Iran, in every sphere. Not only he is now the Secretary General of the Supreme National Security Council, but he's the personal representative of leader Mojtaba Khamenei. So this puts him up there, very close to the eclipse of the sun, up there, with immense authority, immense experience. He actually was fighting during the Iran-Iraq war. He already led the IRGC. He was a presidential candidate. So he did all the motions, of course. And a top military advisor to the leader, of course. And now his own personal representative. So we can say that in terms of who's closest to Mojtaba Khamenei today is Mohsen Rezai, among all others, other members of the Supreme National Security Council, Ghalibaf, the Ministry of Foreign Relations, etc. The preeminence is Rezai. He knows the US very, very well. He knows the psychology of the empire. He knows how the empire is run. Before his new post, he gave, I'm sure you saw this interview, a long interview he gave to Iranian media, I think around an hour or so. And I received an excellent English translation. And I read it at least twice, and it's impressive. You know, he's on top of every dossier. And basically, and he's not aggressive. There's no hubris involved. He's absolutely convinced that Iran is inflicting a strategic defeat on the United States, but he's not gloating. On the contrary, he's saying, if they change their behavior, it's going to be good for them. And then we can start really a conversation between a big power and an ascending power, which at the moment, when we see what happened in the battlefield and afterwards, we have to talk as equals, and they have to respect us. all of us who know how the American system works, how Washington works, and how the American elites view the rest of the world, know that a conversation like this will be impossible. Which proves to all of us, once again, that they won't be able to find an off-ramp of this war that was started by their current president. And it will be detrimental to their own national interests, not to mention their international geopolitical interests. But this is not Iran's problem. Iran knows exactly what they did, what they have to do, what they signed and plan to respect, which is the Memorandum of Understanding, all the 14 points. They are secure about their very important geopolitical relations across Eurasia, starting with Russia, their very good relations with Pakistan, the relations that are kept on, I would say, an acceptable level with Turkey, and especially their very good relations with China. So all these relations all tend to improve. So they are sure of themselves, they are self-confident, they have tweaked the way the government works and their military strategy works. Only in the space of these past few weeks, as you've been following it. And it's immensely impressive. And the impression that everybody that's analyzing what they're doing closely, it's our case as independent analysts. We cannot help being impressed as how well coordinated the whole thing is. And of course, they're not in a hurry. They run the clock. They know everything about the immense pressure over Trump from all corners. And Mohsen Rezai, for instance, is one of the top analyzers of how Trump is cornered from everywhere, and also cornered by himself, by his psyche, by his psychology of a 4-year-old toddler cycle, essentially. So they are on top of everything that is going on. Does this mean that this will translate as a way out of the war for Iran? Not necessarily. Because as you mentioned in the beginning, which is very, very important, the Americans also tweaked their strategy. Finally, it can be a series of vectors, including somebody with an IQ over 50 around the White House corridors. There are not many candidates, but at least one of them may slip, have a 5-minute moment with the President of the United States and tell him, look, everywhere you do, and if you continue to do what you do, you're going to be even more screwed up than you are already now. So you need to change your strategy. And this change of strategy is something that many of us already were suspecting that would be the new American strategy about a month ago or even more. And it's something that the absolutely ghastly Jared Kushner was whispering on Trump's ear, which is a strategy of maximum economic pressure. And that's where the other absolutely ghastly character, Scott Bessent, comes in. And Scott Bessent is absolutely convinced that they are winning, and they are going to win an economic pressure war against Iran. Okay, that's his problem. The Iranians are not paying attention to that. The Iranians are paying attention to how the economy works, how their internal pressures, the fact that their channels of communication with their neighbors are open, that the overland channels with Pakistan, for instance, in terms of trade back and forth is open, Chinese investments, they're open, all that. And even stuff that most people don't even think about. Iran is building a corridor to Armenia to expand their exports via the international north-south transportation corridor via Armenia, and then from Armenia, from the Caucasus, it can be anywhere west. So they continue to invest in important infrastructure projects, even now that the war is not over. Then we have the fact that Iran is going to become a member of the BRICS Bank, the NDB. It could be sealed next month in Delhi during the annual BRICS summit, or slightly later. It's going to be very complicated, as it was in Russia. For instance, the NDB cannot make loans to Russia because of sanctions. So there's got to be a way around the system of sanctions so Iran can get projects financed by the NDB. But everybody will be on it, starting with people who run the NDB. Our friend President Dilma Rousseff, which sometimes is not as efficient as she should be, because she's under immense constraints. They have to reevaluate the statutes of the NDB for the NDB to function as a bank, a real global South development bank, which they are not yet. And for countries in the global South, finally escape the World Bank, the IMF, the World Bank, the Bretton Woods system. This process has started, but it's very slow. It's going to take a lot of time. But if Iran joins the NDB, that's already a big, big step, because Iran is preparing the terrain for when they will be able to enjoy these loans from the NDB. So, the Iranian economy, of course, under enormous constraints, facing serious problems, inflation, devaluation of the real, you name it, but this train is still rolling. They won't be suffocated by American pressure. They can be destabilized on and off by some actions like the Americans when they destabilized the real last year. They had a run against the real. They're going to have other runs against the real. So the thing is, if Iran is doing a lot of business with Russia and China and etc., and in bypassing the dollar in other countries, in other currencies, they can be more protected. So now we are seeing a retweaking of the whole chessboard. This is included in my new analysis of the new great game, which in this first essay, I focused on how Iran changed their own game, how they can profit from their strategic victory. And then I had to analyze some specific cases. One of them is the Mecca Pact, Saudi, Pakistan, Turkey. What does it really mean? The other important factor is Afghanistan. The other important factor is the Caspian Sea. So all that is interrelated at the center of Eurasia. So in the next essay, probably if I do it next month, I want to go deeper into Russia, China, and Central Asia and Caucasus, and the relation between Russia, China with Central Asia and Caucasus. This one, I focus on the relations between Iran, Turkey, Central Asia, a little bit of the Caucasus, but also going all the way to Afghanistan, Pakistan. So, okay, let's call it the introduction for the new Great Game Revisited. It's a fascinating, as many of you know, the original Great Game, was the late 19th, early 20th century between the British Empire and the Russian Empire. It ended inconclusively, but basically to the benefit of the Russian Empire at the time. And now it's, of course, everything is about the Americans, and about the Americans after, during, and after they are suffering two strategic defeats at the same time against these three civilization states: the strategic defeat in Ukraine and the strategic defeat in Iran. So we can expect the hybrid war in several different declinations by the empire from now on to become even more vicious than it has been so far.
Epi, what do you make of the military pact between Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey? And is that gonna be the basis or the initial moves on the part of the governments in these countries to reshape the whole region, or is you see something because there was an agreement between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia before, and right now Turkey is coming in. What does that mean? What do you make of it?
Well, in this essay, I venture a few hypotheses, and in many of the podcasts I've been doing lately, the same thing, because we don't have access to the full text. We only had access, everybody, we only had access to minimal leaks and emphasizing the theme of strategic deterrence or credible deterrence. But this basically focus on the fact that Pakistan is a nuclear power. And obviously this is serious deterrence. But nothing about the motivations of this Mecca deal. If this was merely a technical matter, it would have been signed in Riyadh. But we have to pay very close attention to the symbology of the signing being in Mecca. What the Saudis are trying to project is that this is a deal that concerns the Ummah. It concerns all Muslim lands. Not true. This is a deal that concerns a few leaders among the Ummah, which are mostly despised by their own people. It's a completely different story. For instance, would be really pertinent to the signing in Mecca if some leaders of the Ummah had made a pact signed in Mecca to defend Gaza and Palestine. Did they do that? Of course not. So they signed a dodgy deal, which nobody has access to. Nobody really knows what's in the deal apart from the infinite blah, blah, blah on the Article 5 NATO-style provision. An attack on one is an attack on all three for the moment. But there are some side stories around the deal which are particularly intriguing. What is this pact? Who is this pact designed against? There are several options, some of them really, really hardcore. It could be against Eretz Israel, Greater Israel. That makes sense coming especially from Pakistan. Turkey, we don't know because Turkey is always hedging. Turkey is still doing business with Israel. It would take one phone call by Erdogan to close the tap on the BTC pipeline when it arrives in Ceyhan, and not a drop of oil will be transported by tankers from Ceyhan to Israel. This phone call was never placed. So Israel is getting at least 40% of their oil, if not more, from the BTC pipeline, which runs essentially through Turkey, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Turkey. Don't forget that NATO, Turkey is the second largest army in NATO. In fact, is the largest army in NATO apart from the United States. This is a better way of putting it. And it's the eastern, very important, strategically eastern arm of NATO, with Anatolia bordering directly Iran. So this is very, very, very serious. So would a pact like that involve NATO if something happened? If it involves Turkey, it would have to involve NATO. But once again, we don't know what's written in the text. These are all suppositions by literally everybody, including other leaders of other governments who are looking at this pact and say, what is this about? Is this against us? Does this favor? Nobody knows for sure. Okay, is this a pact against Iran? It cannot be for several reasons. One of them, Pakistan is a mediator between Iran and the United States, and they have been breaking their backs to pose as solid, trustworthy mediators to the Iranians. And the contacts between the Iranian elite and the Pakistani elite are, practically daily, weekly, certainly, and practically daily, not to mention the phone calls. So they would not undermine their position signing on a pact that would be against Iran. Hakan Fidan, the Turkish foreign minister, he said in public, on the record, that Ankara called Tehran before and told them, look, we're going to sign this thing in Mecca. It has nothing to do with you. And obviously the Iranians will be asking the Pakistanis, they are already asking the Pakistanis, okay, what is this thing about, really? So this leaves us with the extremely complex role of Saudi Arabia. This was signed in Mecca. This was, MBS made a big deal out of it. We don't know anything about decisions taken in Riyadh because this is one of the most opaque systems on the planet. Nobody knows what really goes on inside the corridors of the House of Saud. Okay, maybe some details, but especially what goes on inside MBS's mind. So maybe it could be for him to pose as geopolitical, in geopolitical terms, to be on top of everything and united with the very important NATO member and the only Muslim nuclear member. That's one thing. Which brings us to, okay, who are the real enemies of Saudi Arabia? And that gives us a little bit of the answer, depending on how they're going to maneuver. This could be a pact against Ansar Allah, Yemeni armed forces, and let's say free Yemen. But does Saudi Arabia need Turkish NATO armies and Pakistan nuclear power to fight Ansar Allah and the Houthis? Even if they had it, would that make a difference in terms of fighting Yemen? Less than zero. And the Saudi Arabia-Yemen problem is strictly Saudi Arabia-Yemen. This is a strict problem between Riyadh and Sana'a, which has to be solved by diplomacy between both. What Pakistan could do, for instance, they could pose as brokers if they wanted to. There is already a memorandum of, we have to remember that. There is already a memorandum of understanding. You remember, MOU, the cat that never refuses to die, between the US and, well, there is one between Sana'a and Riyadh. And who broke it? The Saudis. So they will have to respect their own MOU that they signed with Sana'a because they were having their asses kicked. So they had to sign this in 2019. So when you look at all the possible candidates of who this pact is directed against, not much holds, in fact, apart from, in the future, the death cult, Israel. Then it would make sense. For Pakistan, Israel is a fierce enemy, and vice versa. For Turkey, a lot of psycho crazes from Israel had already been announced in public that the next one is, after Iran, the next enemy to be fought is Turkey. And Saudi Arabia is complicated because there are many solid...
Maybe not only Turkey and the occupation of Syria, which is one of the major issues for Turkey.
You're right. And the occupation of Syria, exactly. We're going to get there via another way, which is even more interesting. Okay, give me 1 minute, just to finish Saudi Arabia. Very close ties between the Zionists and the House of Saud. So that complicates, and of course, the American pressure over the House of Saud, pressure manipulating the House of Saud against Yemen and against Iran. Or, to put it even more bluntly, the Americans manipulated the House of Saud against the axis of resistance. This will not stop. And the last complicating factor, which is probably the definitive complicating factor, Saudi Arabia has no money in Saudi Arabia. All the money is in London and New York. So guess who controls their funds? So they are not sovereign. They're not independent. They cannot make their own decisions. That's why they're always hedging. That's why they said they would become a BRICS member, and still they are not a BRICS member. They are over the wall. They did not say, okay, we refuse. They say, okay, we accept, but they didn't sign anything, and they are not full members. So nothing that comes from Saudi Arabia, it's untrustworthy on a cosmic level, the House of Saud. Syria. The latest we have from Syria is a fascinating demonstration by Iran, graphic, in fact, basically telling the new, how can I describe him? The former
HTS.
Cutthroat or head-cutting head of Al-Qaeda in Syria, head chopper. Exactly. Sorry, I was thinking about something different. The former slit-throater and head chopper, former head of Al-Qaeda in Syria and former head of ISIS in Syria, receiving an indirect message which apparently was relayed from the Iranians. Guess by who? By the Turks. So the Iranians sent a message to Turkey. Turkey sent a message to Damascus. If you do anything to interfere in Lebanon and go against Hezbollah in Lebanon, you are not even toast. You are burnt toast, including you, head chopper, in your fancy palace in Damascus. Apparently, they got the message. So this means, once again, that there are serious grounds for a Syrian resistance to start organizing themselves from now on, with help, once again, from Iran and Hezbollah. And sooner rather than later, this current arrangement in Damascus will collapse. In fact, it will collapse. It's a matter of time, right? And there's not much the Turks can do about it. The Turks are overstretched. They cannot run that corridor from Aleppo to Damascus. They don't have the means. They don't have the military means. They don't have the money. They don't have anything. So this thing sooner or later will collapse. It's being sustained at the moment essentially by the Americans, indirectly, in fact. And of course, if Israel tries, I would say, extra horrors against Syria, apart from the extra horrors that they inflicted on southern Lebanon, the axis of resistance will respond, because now the new tweaked strategy of the axis of resistance, it's much more offensive than so far had been defensive. And this is everything in terms of the reorganization of the Iranian government, in terms of this is our friends in Yemen. They are really badasses. If you mess with them, you are in deep, deep trouble. And of course, Hashd al-Shabi in Iraq, which was attacked directly by the US-Saudi combo. So there will be a response or several responses. So the axis of resistance is mobilized, completely mobilized. And this new Iranian emphasis on let's go on the offense, this applies not only to Iran, but to the whole axis of resistance. So we have the sides, we have both camps drawn. We don't know how the US is going to manage, especially in an electoral year now, before the midterms, their support to Israel or their divergences with Israel, and the fact of how they're going to manage the ongoing strategic defeat with Iran, and of course, everything that is right in front of us. The global economic crisis, the American economic crisis, depletion of strategic petroleum reserves, you name it. And if Saudi Arabia tries anything fancier, very, very simple. They will be totally blockaded from the Red Sea. They are partially blockaded now. They still can escape via the Strait of Hormuz, but they are Basically, they cannot export oil through the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb. They are under the Yemeni blockade as well. And if they try anything fancy, the Yemenis already told them, say bye-bye to the East-West pipeline, say bye-bye to Yanbu, and say bye-bye to your other Red Sea ports. That's it. You won't be able to export a drop of oil. And the Yemenis have all it takes to make it work. So that's, once again, how the chessboard is moving literally by the minute all the time, and there are new reconfigurations. The most important one, which is conditioning everything that's moving across the chessboard, is this reorganization at the top of the Iranian government. So we have to pay attention to I would say to every single word coming from Mohsen Rezai. And he has an X account, and his X account moves. There's always something.
Pepe, before coming to this live, we've learned that the Yemenis and Ansarullah attacked Saudi Arabia, their oil refinery the oil refinery.
This oil refinery now is exactly, it's out of business for the moment. It's out of business.
If I'm not mistaken, it has a capacity of 400,000.
400,000 a day. Out of business already. So this is, once again, a Yemeni message. You better come to your senses, or this is only going to get worse. And by the way, was there any peep coming from the signatories of the Mecca Pact? Zero, nothing. And of course, they could even spin, yes, Saudi Arabia is being attacked by Yemen. Let's go after them. They are clever enough not to get in the middle of this thing, especially against Ansarullah and the Yemeni armed forces. So there's nothing Saudi Arabia can do. They can sign 10 more Mecca pacts. It's not going to change their predicament.
The question is, Pepe, who's going to outlast the other side? Is it going to be Iran? Is it going to be the United States and GCC countries with the situation they're in right now with the Strait of Hormuz, with Bab el-Mandeb, and with the American blockade on Iran, Iranian control and dominance over the Strait of Hormuz? Who's going to outlast the other side?
No, this is crystal ball territory, Diva. We don't know. And anybody who will tell you they know, they are lying. What we do know is that this is going to become fiercer than it already is. And it has all the makings of a forever war. All the elements are there. It could become an absolutely terrifying forever war with ups and down, breaks, pauses, and then the whole thing restarts. Economic war, financial war, the direct connection which was there from the beginning that American armchair analysts just discovered the other day, that the war in Ukraine, the war against Iran are the same. Of course, they are the same war, idiots. It was always the same war. And it's a war against the three civilization states, against Russia, against Iran, and further on down the road against China. And in many aspects, already against China, in Ukrainian territory and in Iranian territory, and of course, around the trade, commerce connections of China in West Asia. So this will become, the war that changes and is changing the 21st century is this one. It's going to be the title of my next book to be published in the US. The war that changes the 21st century is this one. Everybody thought it would be the NATO war in Ukraine by proxy, or the direct war between NATO and Russia. No, this is the one that is going to change the chessboard much more than any other war. Because West Asia, as we all know, is immensely sensitive for the whole planet because of energy, because this is an oil war. This is an oil choke point war. This is a war against an independent actor which was selling energy bypassing the US dollar. So this is a petrodollar war. This is a war to try to save the petrodollar. This is a war against now the most important power in West Asia, winning, inflicting a strategic defeat, and now winning the war and dictating the terms for a settlement of this war with help from the strategic partnership between Russia and China. So this makes the nightmare for the empire completely out of proportion. People who think across the Beltway in the US, they see that this is a war against two big powers, and one, as Moshe Rezai has defined it, the fourth power. All three Eurasia, all three civilization straits, all three BRICS members, all three Shanghai Cooperation Organization members, all three leaders of the Global South. Does the US have all it takes to fight these three at the same time? Everybody knows they don't. And that's why they're freaking out. And that's why especially the elites are freaking out. And that's why they have as their plan B now, okay, let's strangle them economically and financially. As you all know, and as Nima knows, as you, Nima, know very well, Iran can resist anything. They are self-sufficient. They won't be strangled economically. And of course, they have their network of support all across Eurasia, in several points of Eurasia, and especially in the background, Russia and China. So they won't be strangled economically, period. So there's nothing left for the empire. There's nothing left. And it's going to be much worse after the midterms. And if, depending on what we have afterwards, there are two possibilities. One, in the next elections, 2 years, two years and a little bit from now, we have a democratic administration, or if we have an impeachment of Trump and we have Vance as president. None of that will change. It will be a minimal change of degree, but these elements of hybrid war and this forever war against Iran and the axis of resistance is not going to disappear. So we all have to live with it.
Do you think that Donald Trump is going to continue this war till the end of his presidency, or he's going to learn from it? Because the sign on the part of Iranians, when you look at the way that Iranians are talking about it, they basically saying that there is nothing to happen with the Trump administration. No serious thought, no serious people.
No, and now with Moshe Rezai as deciding side by side with leader Moshtaba. And Moshtaba, from the beginning, as you well know, Nima, he never believed in any negotiations with the Americans. And everything has proven, his point has been proven by the facts. So this is not going to change. So, the Iranian resistance and the recalibrated way Iran is going to impose its resistance and impose its demand on the US is going to become even harsher for the Americans to agree to anything and to accept anything. So this war can be on slow motion for a long time. And then we're going to have ups and downs. So it will repeat once again the pattern in Ukraine. Everybody thought that the war in Ukraine would last maximum, a year and a half, maximum 2. I remember every time I was going to Russia these past 4 years, the war is going to finish in 2025. Nope. The war might finish, depending on what the Russians do, in the next few months. So this would mean early 2027. Or it could keep going on in slow motion for a long, long time. Because once again, if the war ends in Ukraine, this is the strategic defeat not only of the West, but the whole of NATO, which means the disintegration of NATO. They cannot live with that. They cannot admit it. Just like why the Americans simply cannot relieve sanctions and pay Iran's money back to Iraq, because this would be admitting their strategic defeat. It always comes back to the same point. When you inflict serious, once again, strategic blow against a big power, it's very hard for the big power to recover. And we are, this is where we are in both theaters of the war. And it's going to get much worse for the empire and, of course, for the vassals. And that's where we could place Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, they have to get their act together and change a direction, which they can't. They invested too much in being an American vassal. So for them, it's absolutely impossible to do. Out of the question. There are no solutions for them. And even coming with this Hail Mary NATO-style Mecca deal is not going to save them. So this is one of the possible consequences of what's happening at the moment. All these petro-monarchies, the GCC petro-monarchs, sooner rather than later, they will all collapse. No exceptions. Especially the big brother, Saudi Arabia. Well, that's it, Nima. They have to live with the fact that Iran is winning. And they have to admit it. And they have to face it. Which is something, for instance, that Oman and Qatar, they are already at least starting. Okay, we have to live with them, so we have to cooperate with them. We cannot antagonize them. They were the first two GCCs who understood. The others, reality will tell them. Nima, I'm sorry, but I have to go. I'm so sorry.
No problem. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Pep. Pretty good.
Thank you.
Military ammo.
Do we have any
Larry?
ammo?
We're out.
We're out.
We have depleted on the defensive missile side, ATACMS and THAADs. They're virtually at zero.
The U.S. military under Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth. By the way, I love Pete Hegseth because
his hair never dries.
He wanted to make sure they changed it from the Department of Defense to the Department of War, and then he lost his first war.
Nice.
Nice. So they're out of missiles. So they're out. They send all these missiles to Ukraine.
Long range ones.
They send then they already used all their missiles against Yemen, and they used all their missiles again. And now we're out of missiles.
Time for boots on the ground.
And it takes a long time. So according to Reuters, U.S. has used virtually all its long-range precision missiles during Iran war. Almost all of them. Well, hey, how about this? Maybe now we could just launch American children at them. How about that? It's not ideal, but this is for Israel. So no kidding. We're out of our missiles. They're out of them. And it's going to be at least until 2027. And here's the ultimate irony, okay? In order to make our missiles, the Patriot missiles and the Jasmines and the ATACs or whatever they call, in order to make them, guess what you need? You need rare earth minerals.
From China.
Guess where you get those rare earth minerals? The $67,000 China.
Same place we get our Trump phones.
And China is not going to sell us any rare earth minerals.
That's not cool. Come on. This is why we have to fight China, because they're being dicks.
Because they won't sell us the stuff to buy missiles so we can bomb them.
Look, if we're going to keep up with China,
the U.S.
They're going to have to make our missiles for us.
The U.S. Army has used up much of its global stockpile in highly accurate long-range missiles during its 5-month war with Iran, according to 3 people. There's way more people, according to. The missiles are primarily the Army's surface-to-surface weapons known as Army Tactical Missile Systems, or ATACMS, and precision strike missiles, PRSMs. So the 2 different kinds, plus Jasmine missiles, plus what they call Patriot missiles. The U.S. has used virtually all of these weapons. Okay. The degree to which the military is running out of them has not been previously reported. The long-range munitions, which cost more than $1 million each, are an important part of the military's arsenal, allowing accurate strikes from a safe distance. U.S.-supplied ATACMS have played a key role in the war in Ukraine, allowing Ukraine forces to attack targets inside Russia. The PRSMs is newer, more advanced generation that will replace the ATACMS, which have a shorter range. The dramatic rundown in precision long-range missiles means President Trump may have to rely more on riskier, piloted bombing missions if he relaunches large-scale attacks on Iran. And let me tell you something about our fighter pilots with those jets break all the time, right? So we do not have this crazy air superiority people think, because as soon as they start using those jets, they break.
Oh, Israel's not going to want to merge militaries with us.
As the war drags on, the 3 people familiar with the matter expressed worry that the falling missile supplies could limit U.S. ability to deter adversaries, including Russia and China. Guess what? China doesn't want a war with us. Neither does Russia. You know who wants war? The military-industrial complex, which owns our Congress. Congress and the president are middle managers. They are not the people in control. The people in control sit above the government. It's called capital. It's called the billionaire class, the WEF. It's called the military-industrial complex. It's called the oil companies. It's called Silicon Valley. So capital is above, the people with the money are above the government. The government are middle managers, and they want war with Russia and China because it fills their pockets with money. A 4th person familiar with the matter said that despite a high-range usage of precision weapons, the U.S. can resupply. They cannot. Central Command, which oversees U.S. forces in the Middle East, has been able to reload from U.S. military supplies around the world, meaning they have to take their military supplies from around China, from Korea, from Ukraine. They have to take all that. So they're out of them. And China is not going to sell us the materials we need to make more. Asked for a comment on the stockpile, the White House issued a statement, and Trump said, far more munitions than anyone in the world, far more than we need. Okay. The supply figures have circulated inside the federal government over the last week during tense conversations inside the Trump administration about how much longer the U.S. can continue striking Iran without drawing down the stockpile to levels that would limit the military's ability to respond to, meaning we can't protect our own country. Like if somebody wanted to attack us, we don't have missiles. One of the sources said the drawdown of ATACMS and PRSM stockpiles reflected a decision by Trump administration to avoid riskier ways of attacking Iranian targets, such as by using piloted aircraft to drop bombs, because they'll shoot them down. So basically, we're out of keep America boots off the ground munitions.
Yeah, that's what I said. Fire American kids at them, I say.
Hotspot says Reuters reports that the U.S. military has expended virtually all of its entire inventory of Army tactical missiles and precision strike missiles during the 5-month war with Iran. With each missile costing more than $1 million, replacement stocks are not expected to be available until. So here's our friend Larry Johnson. Hey, Larry, how many missiles do we have left?
What is the state of military ammo?
Do we have any
Larry?
ammo?
We're out.
We're out.
We have depleted on the defensive missile side, ATACMS and THAADs. They're virtually at zero. Some said that there may be some. We're talking hundreds left. No, not really. It's the numbers. The numbers are so small, it's ridiculous. The same for if you call it the mid-range strike missiles, such as the Tomahawk cruise missile, the JASSM cruise missile, which is also launched from a 5th generation fighter, 4th generation fighter, the ATACMS missiles, and the new replacement for the ATACMS called the PRISM. All of these have been run down to levels that they can't be replaced, and they won't be replaced anytime soon, because this is not a matter of Congress needing to appropriate more money. They require rare earth minerals, or 4 rare earth minerals and tungsten. And it is essential that people understand that China controls the supply chains, because the actual rare earth minerals, Canada has them, we have them here in Florida. The problem is processing them. So that when you take the raw rare earth minerals to process them, to turn them into their final product, China's the only one doing that, doing 90% of it in the world. So they are in a very powerful position. And without those rare earth minerals, you can't build a new ATACMS. You can't build a new PAC-3 for the Patriot. You can't build a new Tomahawk. I came across a statistic that I found stunning. 78% of all the weapons that DoD produces for the various military services, 78% are dependent upon 4 rare earth minerals and tungsten. And it means China basically controls the United States' ability to rearm itself. Quite the irony there.
Right. From your sources and your understanding, has Hegseth deceived Trump, or has Trump deceived the American public about adequate military supplies for defensive purposes?
No, Trump's deceived the public. He was told, and yet we're watching the finger pointing that's going on allegedly. That when Trump was supposedly angry with Hegseth tried to deflect it by saying, no, it's not me, it's my deputy Feinberg. Feinberg did it. So the first law of plumbing is kicked in. All sewage flows downhill, and it falls on the lowest level people.
I think that Axel saying is shit rolls downhill. Yeah. So here's what Max Blumenthal had to say. The scale of military failure is even worse than this. Besides running out of key standoff munitions, a new CSIS report finds the U.S. has blown through 65% of Patriot and THAAD stock. It's even lower than that. So that's what Larry Johnson said. It's less than 100 missiles, and will take years to replace them. Meanwhile, the U.S. is evacuating Gulf bases and repositioning refueling tankers to Israel's Ramon Air Base, making sorties over Iran even more challenging. Here's what Glenn Greenwald says. These increasing dire warnings about how the U.S. has largely depleted the anti-missile defense systems and even offensive weapons like these have been circulating in D.C. for 18 months at least. The U.S. gave them to Ukraine and to Israel, and used them against Yemen and Iran, and to protect Israel and Persian Gulf dictatorships. The U.S. spends more on its military than any other country by far, and yet the Pentagon hasn't been able to pass an audit in many years and doesn't have the weapons needed to fight a protracted war against Iran, to say nothing of doing something like defending Taiwan. One can debate if it's a good or bad thing. Those are separate questions. But the corruption and waste of U.S. taxpayer money to fill the pockets of Boeing, Raytheon, and Palantir is virtually unlimited. So they are looting the country. So we're in that stage of empire. They're looting the country. They're printing money, which means the money you have in the bank is worth less. Every time they print money, which they do, they print over $1 trillion every couple of months. They print $1 trillion in money. They give it to weapons manufacturers, fill their pockets, and now Trump has also given it to AI companies. And that money is now worth way less than it was just a few years ago. Hey, maybe we can combine wars or something. Maybe we can combine those wars. Trump rejected Zelensky's request for more Patriot missiles because we don't got any. Citing depleted U.S. stockpiles after Ukraine missed 28 incoming Russian missiles overnight. Here is so down here it says, no, we've got nearly 80% of our key missiles. That's CNN says that. Of course they do. Pete Heck says the banner is not true. Shame on you. We don't hate the fake news media. No. In fact, it says, no, wait a minute. It says source says the U.S. has used nearly 80% of key. It's actually worse than that, Pete Hegseth. It's actually worse than that.
I just want to correct the thing that Greenwald said about they can't pass an audit. That's not true. You were not allowed to audit them. That's what their fucking role is. They won't ever be audited. They just pass an audit. That would act like they're not in charge of you.
Hegseth says not giving the DOD 1.5 trillion in funding is the greatest threat U.S. faces. Hey, look, the headline, they misspelled drunken puppet blathers nonsense. Anti-war, Lockheed Martin scores $58.6 billion Patriot contract as it continues to cash in on the Iran war. $58 billion to one company. You know how much the music industry makes in a year? All the music that's ever published and sold. You know how much they make a year? $12 billion a year.
Well, that's not as good as pharma.
That just one contract to one company, $58 billion.
Well, as long as it's going to good people, that's what that matters.
The U.S. Army has awarded Lockheed Martin a contract worth up to $58 billion to ramp up production of the Patriot missiles. According to The Hill, the deal converts a previous one-year contract worth $4.7 billion to a multi-year deal to provide U.S. military with supply of interceptors through 2032, except they can't make them because they don't have the material. While the depletion of U.S. air defenses presents the Trump administration with a strategic dilemma regarding the continuation of the war with Iran, as current production levels cannot keep up with the rates at which they're being used, the shortages are a boon for U.S. arms makers and are helping the Trump administration justify its ask for a massive $1.5 trillion military budget in 2027, more than a 40% increase from this year's budget.
Oh, Lindsey Graham is smiling in closeted gay heaven right now.
Remember what Julian Assange taught us about these wars. They're not meant to be won.
Because the goal is not to completely subjugate Afghanistan. The goal is to use Afghanistan to wash money out of the tax bases of the United States, out of the tax bases of European countries, through Afghanistan, and back into the hands of a transnational security elite. That is the goal, i.e. the goal is to have an endless war, not a successful war.
That's it. The goal is not to win these wars or end the wars. It's to have ongoing, endless wars, which is why Joe Biden was allowed to end the Afghanistan war, because they had the Ukraine war in the chamber. I knew it. I said it at the time. People were patting Joe Biden on the back for ending the Afghan war. I go, wait, did he say what he's going to do with that money we were spending in Afghanistan? No, he didn't, because that's why he was allowed to do that and allowed to leave all our equipment there, because if you leave all our equipment there, then you have to make new ones. And guess who makes all our money? Raytheon, Boeing.
Also, we're paying the Taliban with the equipment. That idea that they disabled is fake. They have lithium there. That Chinese problem is a real problem, and that's a lithium triangle, which is out there, is why the Taliban won that war, and we're fine with it, just like we're fine with Al Qaeda now. Did anybody lose a limb who's watching this in that war? You wasted your limb.
You wasted it.
Yeah, they won, and also your leaders are the ones that commanded you to go die. They're friends with them. That's where you live.
The people who blew your arms and legs off and killed your friends and your sons and daughters. The U.S. government's friends with them.
We paid them with our equipment.
They put the head of Al Qaeda in charge of Syria, and they invited him to the White House. We still have Guantanamo Bay open, but the chief head chopper from the Al Qaeda is being welcomed at the White House, as we still have Guantanamo Bay open. Think about that. Okay, well, if you like to hear my jokes about this, come see me in September 13th.
Against the backdrop of harsh Western sanctions and unprecedented economic pressure from the United States, Russia is not only continuing to win one victory after another in the economic war against the so-called collective West, but also shocking the world with its significant achievements. So, a few days ago, it became known that Russian engineers had built a modern mining and processing plant in the Arctic region, which will significantly enhance the capabilities of the Russian military-industrial complex. This modern plant has already begun supplying Russia with copper, palladium, platinum, and other metals, essential to both military and civilian industries. My dear truth seekers, in this video I will explain in detail how Russia managed to build this modern plant in such extreme natural conditions of the Arctic region, and why this event so deeply shocked Moscow's enemies. Furthermore, in this video, you will be provided with valuable information about a distinctive Russian operation conducted in the Arctic, that lasted over 2 years and served as compelling evidence that Russia is the dominant power in this most resource-rich region of the world. So, a few days ago, in the industrial district of Norilsk, Russia launched a modern mining and processing plant. My friends, this plant has become the second largest center in Russia for producing metals such as palladium and platinum. In addition, this plant will produce nickel, copper, and other metals essential for the construction of ballistic missiles and conventional civilian aircraft. My dear truth seekers, you must understand that all sectors of production, from microelectronics to shipbuilding, require metals from the platinum group. And a modern mining and processing plant in the Arctic is ready to provide Russia with all these metals. Once this plant reaches full capacity, it will produce 10 million tons of processed ore each year. All of this will result in the plant extracting 260,000 tons of copper-nickel concentrates from the processed ore every 12 months. Moreover, after exploration of new fields in the Arctic, the plant's capacity will double, allowing it to produce 15 million tons of processed ore per year. All of this will ensure Russia's resource base for the next 70 years, and will enable Russian military engineers to produce complex weapons systems without any problems, even under harsh sanctions and in the context of war. Undoubtedly, the construction of a modern mining and processing plant in the Arctic is one of the most complex industrial projects implemented by Russian engineers. The thing is that this plant was built in the very harsh climatic conditions of the Arctic. Moreover, this plant was built in a deserted area, with absolutely nothing. As a result, the engineers had to deliver all the necessary materials using Russian icebreakers, via the Northern Sea route. Throughout the entire construction period of this plant, Russian icebreakers delivered 300,000 tons of cargo. In total, 250 facilities were built in this area, including the factory infrastructure, a thermal power plant, a gas pipeline, and engineering networks. The factory itself has provided jobs to 1,800 people. The second challenge Russian engineers faced during the construction of this plant was that the facility's design had been approved before relations with the West were severed. Russian engineers wanted to use some innovative Western technologies in the construction of this plant. However, after the start of the special military operation, Russian engineers had to redesign everything, literally on the fly. Russian engineers rejected all Western technologies and used only Russian technological solutions in the construction of this plant. Despite all these difficulties, Russian engineers managed to build and launch this plant within 5 years, which is an outstanding result, especially considering the technological complexity of this facility. At the same time, Russian engineers managed to turn this plant into the most modern and technologically advanced in all of Europe. As it turned out, Russian engineers incorporated a combined gravity flotation technology for metal extraction and a cutting-edge system for the safe dry storage of so-called metal tailings into the plant's design. Moreover, this plant also uses the latest information technologies, including those based on artificial intelligence. These cutting-edge technologies make it possible to manage mining operations and plan the movement of heavy equipment without direct human involvement. In addition, artificial intelligence carefully monitors the proper functioning of complex equipment and helps improve its efficiency. My dear truth seekers, the Arctic remains the richest region in the world. The Arctic has everything necessary to maintain Russia's strategic sovereignty. That is precisely why Russia continues to build factories and plants in the Arctic, even in the context of a war with the so-called collective West, led by the United States. Starting in 2026, the cargo turnover of all Russian seaports in the Arctic increased by 16%. Moreover, by the end of 2026, shipments via the Northern Sea Route will reach a record 50 million tons. Simultaneously, Russia continues to create favorable conditions for its allies in the Arctic. For example, Russia has significantly expanded its cooperation with China and India, which have banned their sailors from entering the Strait of Hormuz. In this regard, an increasing number of Chinese and Indian ships have started to use the Russian Northern Sea Route. By the way, earlier this month, Russia completed a unique operation in the Arctic. Unfortunately, for some inexplicable reason, the media chose to keep quiet about this significant event. So, for the first time in human history, the Russian icebreaker Arctic of Project 22220 managed to ensure the passage for the Russian scientific vessel Severny Pallias through the Greenland sector, where the heaviest ice in the Arctic region is located. The Russian icebreaker managed to break through ice up to 5 meters thick, setting an absolute record in human history. Due to the harsh climatic conditions, this area of the Arctic is not used for navigation. However, the crew of the Russian icebreaker proved the opposite, and managed to ensure a safe passage for the scientific vessel Severny Pallias in the most dangerous sector of the Arctic region. Thanks to this, the Russian scientific vessel covered nearly 7,000 kilometers, while the scientists on board carried out about 100 scientific studies and conducted more than 50 experiments, ranging from atmospheric to hydroacoustic ones. The data obtained will enable Russia to gain a much better understanding of the climatic processes in the Arctic region. All this will make navigation for Russian ships safer. By the way, the Russian scientific vessel Severny Pallias became the first in the world to reach a record northern latitude, 89 degrees, 33 minutes. Moreover, in September 2025, this Russian scientific vessel, for the first time in human history, changed course while navigating through thick Arctic ice and headed towards a new ice field. Previously, no scientific vessel could afford such a thing, as they were completely dependent on the winds of the weather and the direction of drifting ice. Thus, Moscow has once again confirmed its leadership in building innovative icebreakers and scientific ships, while also showing the West that Russia remains the true master of the Arctic.
sailing time. For centuries now, ships have followed the same maritime route between Asia and Europe. Now China wants to open a completely different route across the top of the world. As Arctic ice retreats, Beijing is turning a once incredible frozen frontier into a potential new trade corridor. And the price is enormous, to say the least. Let's break it down. A route that could essentially slash sailing times between China and Europe, reduce dependence on crowded maritime choke points, and give China a new strategic link to Western markets. China calls it the Ice Silk Road, and if the route proves commercially viable, it could do more than just shorten a voyage. It could basically redraw the map of global shipping. According to a Financial Times report, Chinese container shipping company is preparing to launch a regular service through the Arctic, linking Ningbo on China's east coast with Felixstowe in Britain. Now, this weekly service will travel along Russia's northern coastline through the Northern Sea route. Sea Legend, the company, reportedly chose the name Ice Silk Road as a modern reference to the ancient Silk Road that connected China with Europe. The route could cut the usual 40-day sailing time between the two ports by roughly half. Interest in the North Sea route is also growing. The route recorded 23 transits last summer. That was up from 15 in 2024. Of course, climate change is also helping open the passage. And research from the University of Southampton also found that peak winter Arctic sea ice fell 5.8% between 2024 and 2025. That's the largest decline on record. The strategic attraction here is also quite clear. Ships can potentially avoid major choke points like the Strait of Hormuz, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, where security threats have repeatedly disrupted shipping since February this year. In fact, the Arctic boom is also driving demand for specialized vessels. Maritime data showing 167 ice-class ships were built last year, the highest number in more than a decade. At least another 164 are due to be built this year. The United States is also aiming to increase its presence in the Arctic, directly challenging Moscow and Beijing. Russia already dominates the region with more than 40 icebreakers and a growing military footprint as well. In October last year, US President Donald Trump, remember, signed an agreement with the Finnish president, basically to expand America's fleet of icebreakers. In case you're not aware, icebreakers are specialized vessels designed to cut through the ice-covered waters, thereby ensuring safe navigation for other ships. Under the deal, the US Coast Guard will acquire up to 11 cutting-edge icebreakers to strengthen national security in the Arctic. The Arctic region covers nearly 1/6 of the Earth's landmass. The region is estimated to hold nearly 20% of the world's undiscovered oil and gas reserves, making it one of the most resource-rich and politically sensitive zones on the planet. But the Arctic remains an unforgiving environment at the same time. Crews must navigate shifting ice, extreme weather, sometimes without reliable GPS. A vessel can also become trapped if the icebreaker support is unavailable. That's how risky it is. Unlike major global shipping lanes, the Arctic has limited infrastructure for emergencies. Firefighting, medical assistance, and rescue can be extremely difficult when something goes wrong. For China, the Ice Silk Road offers speed and also strategic reach. For global shipping, it represents something far bigger, the possibility of a new trade highway emerging from a rapidly changing Arctic.
Today is August 13th, 2026. I saw this article floating around across social media. ProPublica, fiasco in the factory. Taxpayers funded a $533 million artillery plant that made nothing. Let's check out the reporting highlights here. In a rush to process exempted from normal rules, the U.S. hired General Dynamics, which brought on a Turkish subcontractor with little vetting to make artillery shells. Despite being paid $533 million, General Dynamics did not produce a single usable shell at its new factory and has not been held accountable. Well, what's new here? The United States is run by these corporations. Of course, they're not going to hold themselves accountable. And this isn't just the arms industry. This is actually every single major industry in the US, the pharmaceutical industry, the auto industry. All of these corporations are doing these type of things, and they are never held accountable. Since the Army halted 2 production lines at the factory, the General Dynamics unit responsible for the debacle has received contract awards totaling $2.5 billion. Again, what is new? Failure upon failure. They continue to get the money because they're the ones actually running foreign and domestic policy, including the funding that's made available for their maximization of profits. Now let's look at the very end here. The United States is still not close to producing the promised 100,000 shells per month. I did a video on this 2 years ago, and I talked about the 80,000 to 100,000 shells per month goal that they set. I'll get into that in a minute. A former Army official told ProPublica in June, although other investments to increase 155 millimeter production have turned out better, but just marginally better. And I will explain that too in just a moment. Ukraine still needs those shells, the official said, but attention has once again shifted. In the Middle East, it's other munitions that the Trump administration has rapidly burned through. During its war with Iran, Trump officials are now calling for ramping up production in those areas and fast. But I've been talking about this since the Biden administration. This is not a Trump-Biden administration issue. This is the U.S. is run by these corrupt corporations, including corrupt arms manufacturers, and they are short on everything. And I talked about how Patriot missile interceptors, all the way at the beginning of the escalation in Ukraine in 2022, I explained how those were already running short before Russia began its special military operation in Ukraine in 2022. Let's continue. Conventional ammo is back on the back burner, the official said. Everything now is about interceptors, missiles, but that's what it has been about since 2022. It's been missiles, artillery ammunition, tanks, everything else. They've been talking about expanding production for all of these things. Drones, don't forget drones. I'll talk about drones here in just a minute. General Dynamics makes components for those too. Of course. I mean, all of these corporations are interconnected. The board of directors, they play musical chairs, not just in the arms industry, but across different industries. And of course, the shareholders. These are often the same financial institutions holding huge amounts of shares in these corporations. All of them, regardless of General Dynamics, Boeing, Raytheon. They own all of them. So this is how it works. Now, I want to point out that this was actually a news story last month as well. So this is a recent in-depth report, but this was already being reported on in the news since last month. CBS News, defense watchdog finds new 155 millimeter artillery plant failed to produce parts in 2 years since it was built, hindering production goals. And they are talking about General Dynamics, and they're talking about this plant in Texas, the exact same plant. Now, before I get into that, I just want to go to this video that I did February 2024, why U.S. artillery shell production isn't enough and why other munitions will fall far shorter still. And this was CSIS. It's one of these policy think tanks funded by these corporations, including arms manufacturers. Munitions Production Roundtable. And they had Assistant Secretary Douglas Bush. He's the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Acquisition, Logistics, and Technology. And he was talking all about expanding U.S. military industrial production, and especially artillery shells, because at that time, all of the talk was about artillery shells. Russia is making huge amounts of artillery shells. The stockpiles across the West had been exhausted, and monthly production was not enough to match Russian firepower, but Russian production and also firepower on the battlefield. And so what Assistant Secretary Bush talked about was, in order to expand production, the U.S. needs additional funding. Now, the United States has the largest military budget on planet Earth. It's over $1 trillion and constantly growing. It's larger than Russia, China, and Iran's military budgets combined. Actually, Russia's military budget is like 10% of the U.S. military budget. So I don't think additional funding is the issue. He also said you need to have contracts that maximize the additional production capacity created. Why did he say that? Why was that an important point to make? Because if you ask a for-profit corporation to take its factory and make it bigger, bring in additional machinery, bring in an additional number of people for your workforce, order up additional raw materials, make sure your supply chain is expanded to support this additional production capacity, they want to make sure that there is going to be contracts constantly making use of that, all of that, 100% of that production capacity. Because if you're not, you're losing money. And this runs contra to maximizing profits, which is why these corporations exist, which is why the US system itself exists. It exists to acquire as much profit and power as possible. That is what the US system exists to do. That's what the corporations collectively are working together to do, both for themselves and together with each other, because again, a lot of these are the same people across the board of directors, the shareholders, etc. He also talked about, again, Assistant Secretary Douglas Bush, he talked about how we've already doubled artillery shell production. 155 millimeter artillery shell production has already doubled. But then he admitted that this was not because we can ramp up production that quickly, but because the process already began years before Russia began its special military operation in 2022. The US foresaw a need for additional artillery shell production, and so they began investing in it. It's one of the few areas of arms production where there is a US state-owned enterprise, quasi-state-owned enterprise, creating production capacity that might not necessarily be maximized. But of course, all of the parts being fed into this facility, they are made by for-profit corporations like General Dynamics. So they already began expanding ammunition production before 2022. That's why they were able to double it so quickly. It wasn't quickly. It was a process that took several years, and they went from something like 10 to 14,000 rounds per month to 20, maybe 30,000, something like that, around there. So they doubled it, but then they needed to get to 80,000 to 100,000 shells per month, and they've come nowhere even close to reaching that. So again, he began talking about how important surge capacity is, and surge capacity is most definitely important. Assistant Secretary Douglas Bush knows what he's talking about, but he's working in a system that does not care about these fundamentals. They care about maximizing profit, and that's it. And so surge capacity is the exact opposite of maximizing profit. So if you look at Russia and their ability to ramp up production of their artillery shells, why were they able to massively increase production so quickly and so extensively? Why was that possible? Because Russia and China oversee their arms production with state-owned enterprises. It is nationalized and it is existing for a purpose. And the purpose is to make however many arms and ammunition the state requires, no matter what, at whatever cost. That's what they exist to do. Now, you have people in there that are trying to ensure that the process pays for itself. They sell arms abroad. This is to generate revenue. You do not want it to be just an endless, infinite black hole, because that's unsustainable. So they try to make it as sustainable as possible, but they understand that some of this might be at the expense of maximizing profits, and they're okay with that. That's the whole point of having state-owned enterprises and having surge capacity. So you would have Russian factories that would have a huge section of the factory that's unused. It is surge capacity. It's machinery, space, spare parts, raw materials, just sitting there waiting so that the factory can ramp up production if the state asks it to do so. in a relatively quick manner. There's also the workforce. Russia, China, their education system is churning out people who are trained in vocational skills, as well as graduates in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. I've talked about this many, many times. I've shown this Forbes article many times from 2017, updated 2021. And here is this infographic. The countries with the most STEM graduates. Here's the United States. Here's Russia. The US has a much larger population than Russia, but as you can see, the STEM graduates are comparable, around 500,000. China has millions with an S, millions more STEM graduates every year than the United States. That adds up significantly over time. Russia and China have also nationalized a lot of the supply chain elements that feed into their arms and ammunition manufacturers. They also have nationalized the raw materials, the acquisition of raw materials to ensure they have surge capacity there, as well as stockpiles. They also stockpile their ammunition to ensure that they have surge capacity in terms of just drawing down artillery shells, missiles, tanks, aircraft, airframes to be revamped or modified. They have all of this. The United States, and this is something Assistant Secretary Bush pointed out, the US decided to go with just stockpiles because stockpiles made the corporations profits by building up stockpiles. They told Washington, you're going to give us this amount of money and we will create this stockpile. And if you need extra weapons, well, that's where you will get them because that's the way we maximize profits. We're not going to create huge amounts of surge capacity to ramp up production at a moment's notice because that runs contra to maximizing profits. And Assistant Secretary Bush even talked about that. He said, well, you have these large stockpiles, but they're missiles that were built 10, 20 years ago versus the missiles that are being produced now. They're not comparable. They're not the same. You need to be able to ramp up the most recent version of these missiles to be effective on the battlefield when fighting a peer adversary, as the U.S. is doing in Ukraine. That is a U.S. proxy war being fought against Russia simply through Ukraine. And of course, the war the U.S. is seeking to provoke with China is the exact same case where you're not bullying a small country with very poor conventional military capabilities. You're going up against a nation that has similar or even better capabilities than you do. So if you're talking about the United States matching Russia or China or Russia and China in terms of military industrial production, how can this be done? Well, the most obvious way is to just nationalize the arms industry and take all of the profit out of it. Nationalize it, make it a for-purpose industry under a state-owned enterprise, and make as many weapons as is deemed necessary by the state, even if it cuts into your profits or even is a net cost to you. That's how you could do it. That's one way you could do it. Well, that's really the only way you could do it. The place Western policymakers' minds drift off to, since that's not really an option for them, because that would mean fundamentally changing the whole U.S. system, what the U.S. is as a nation at this moment. Their mind drifts elsewhere to, we'll use robots, we'll use AI, we'll use 3D printing, we'll use software-defined manufacturing. That's what Anduril, a startup arms industry, this is how they said they're going to match or exceed Russian and Chinese military industrial production. And if you even go to this ProPublica article, one of the big issues they were talking about is how these robots were breaking down or catching on fire, and how none of the high-tech solutions they thought they were going to use to match just Russian military industrial production, how none of this even really worked out well for them. The other problem is this isn't 1950. This isn't a world in which the U.S. has this overwhelming monopoly over technology and industry. This is a world where there is a greater balance of power between technology, industry, and who has access to this technology. And in many ways, Russia and especially China have access to industrial processes, technology that the U.S. is not able to employ on at all or at the scale Russia and China are employing it at. Anduril thinking that software-defined manufacturing was somehow some magical solution to the problem of China manufacturing more weapons than the US is crazy, because China has been using software-defined manufacturing in their factories for years already. They most certainly can apply it to arms manufacturing as well. So you have technology. The US has technology in a for-profit system. Russia and China have the same technology, except in a for-purpose system. Russia and China will be able to take that same technology and leverage it to do more. This is why they are making more weapons, better weapons than the United States. It's a systemic issue. It is at the very core of what the US is and what Russia and China are. Now, I've talked about factories, the workforce, which is a function of education. I've talked about supply chains, raw materials, surge capacity. These are all the fundamentals of military industrial production. And this is what has shaped the ongoing conflicts the US has provoked around the globe or is.
Revolutionary salute to our family, Mac Heavy, for the 10 jewels to the war chest. Revolution is a way of life. Absolutely appreciate that love, soldier. Salute.
Trying to provoke around the globe. And this is what is also defining the world's reaction to US provocations, especially Russia, China, and Iran to a great degree. And I think I've explained this extensively over the years, along with many other analysts. I'm almost certain I saw this article shared probably on Mark Sloboda's Telegram channel. So now it's 2026. And I did this video back in 2024, why US artillery shell production isn't enough and why other munitions will fall far shorter still. February 2024, I was talking about that 80,000 to 100,000 shells per month target that the US had, how unlikely it was that they would meet it. But even if they did meet it, it would still fall far short of what Russia was producing. So now it's 2026. We hear there's this hiccup in the factory in Texas. But I'm going to tell you right now, that isn't the reason why this has failed. That is just one major reason it hasn't failed, but there are many other reasons why this has all failed. So we were told we'd be at 80,000 155 millimeter shells per month, maybe 100,000 by last year, 2025. It's now 2026. Would you be surprised to find out the US hasn't even come close to achieving half of that? They're not even doing 50,000 shells per month, not even 40,000 shells per month. So let's go to this older CBS News article, well, older, last month. Defense watchdog finds new 155 millimeter artillery plant failed to produce parts in 2 years since it was built, hindering production goals. I'm going to read a little bit from this article. A Pentagon watchdog report found that in the roughly 2 years since it was built, an ammunition plant in Texas, this is the General Dynamics plant, has not produced any parts for 155 millimeter artillery rounds, hindering the Army's goal to help backfill stocks of ammunition provided to Ukraine after Russia invaded in 2022. In a report released, the Defense Department Inspector General found that as of March 2026, the plants had not produced any metal projectile parts that met the specifications laid out in the contract, and the Army's expenditure of $469 million to establish the facility could have been used to address other Army or Department of Defense priorities, or healthcare for Americans, or education for Americans, or relief for all the debt that they've been put into by these for-profits industries and institutions, better infrastructure for Americans in America, things like that. It doesn't say that. I'm adding that on. Over the past 4 years, the Pentagon depleted its inventory of 155 millimeter artillery shells by 3.6 million rounds, according to the report. The report does not note how many rounds are in the stockpile. Probably not many. More than 3 million rounds were given to Ukraine through weapons packages committed by the Biden administration and also under the Trump administration. Roughly 112,000 rounds were used for training and testing, and another 218,000 were sold to other countries and then sent to Ukraine. Based on the consumption in Ukraine and anticipated foreign military sales, the Army in 2024 set a goal to ramp up production of 155 millimeter artillery rounds from 14,000 rounds per month to 100,000 rounds by October 2025. They didn't even come close to half that. And invested in the plant in Texas to help produce specific parts. That plant, which is operated by General Dynamics Ordnance and Tactical Systems, opened in May 2024. As of March 2026, the Army was producing about 36,000 rounds per month, still far short of the 100,000 round goal, in part because the facility in Texas failed to produce any of the 30,000 projectile metal parts it was expected to make each month, according to the report. Let's say those 30,000 projectile metal parts that they were supposed to make translate into an additional 30,000 completed 155 millimeter artillery rounds. You add that to 36,000, you have 66,000 rounds. That's not 80,000, that's not 100,000. So yes, this plant not making anything at all, taking hundreds of millions of dollars, actually billions of dollars if you talk about the additional contracts it was awarded. That's not helping, but that's not the whole problem either. This is systemic. This is a systemic problem. You need to fundamentally change the whole US system. All of this is built on top of to fix this problem. You're not going to fix this problem by building factories like this and giving more money to for-profit corporations. So 66,000 shells per month if this factory was doing what it was supposed to do, but no, 36,000 shells per month. What about Russia? How many artillery shells is Russia making per month? And with a military budget, 10% of the US's 1 trillion plus and always growing military budget. Russia was making something like 40,000 shells per month, more shells than the US is making now, before 2022. It has since ramped up artillery shell production to between 250,000 to 350,000 shells per month, or between 3 and 4.2 million shells a year. And that's like 8,000 rounds a day. Actually, it's more, it's 8,000 plus shells per day. And this was according to this CNN article from 2024. Exclusive, Russia producing 3 times more artillery shells than US and Europe for Ukraine, US and Europe, not just the US. So that in 2024, Russia was producing 250,000 artillery munitions per month, or about 3 million a year, according to NATO intelligence estimates of Russian defense production shared with CNN, as well as sources familiar with Western efforts to arm Ukraine. Collectively, the US and Europe have a capacity to generate only about 1.2 million munitions annually to send to Kiev, a senior European intelligence official told CNN. More recently, we have this from the Modern War Institute at West Point. That's the U.S. Army Academy. The industrial window of war, how to measure Russia's munitions throughput and how to disrupt it. And not to spoil it or anything, but their solutions to disrupt it fall far short of reality. This was March this year. And this is what it says. Russia's battlefield endurance in Ukraine is determined not by the size of Soviet-era stockpiles, but by a temporary industrial window. Remember Assistant Secretary Douglas Bush talking about stockpiles are not a substitute for surge capacity. Russia had both. They had stockpiles and surge capacity, and they have used it, and they have vastly outproduced not just the US, but the US and all of its proxies across Europe and beyond even. So this is a period when production plus imports outpaces daily shell consumption. This is what the article is talking about. In 2025, Russian factories churned out about 7 million artillery, mortar, tank, and rocket rounds, excluding guided multiple launch rocket systems and loitering munitions, roughly 19,000 rounds per day, while open source estimates put Russian expenditure at 10 to 15,000 rounds per day. 10 to 15,000 rounds per day used on and over the battlefield. As long as production and imports meet or exceed consumption, Moscow can sustain the war and rebuild reserves. They can do both at the same time. As that is a huge amount of ammunition. That was as of last year, 2025. This article was written early 2026, March 2026. This is what the article says in conclusion. Russia's industrial advantage is finite. In 2025, the window remained open because factories produced around 7 million shells and imports covered up to half of its artillery consumption. Yet the window is elastic. Cheap drones, foreign suppliers, and cross-theater offsets can stretch it, while sanctioned supply disruptions, demand reduction, deep strikes, and allied industrial surges can compress it. But these latter options that it's listing are imaginary. The US and Europe have now demonstrated they do not have the ability to do industrial surging. They just told you they haven't made a single round. Not a single part has come out of this factory yet. And even if it was at full rate production, it still wouldn't even reach half of their goal of 100,000 rounds per month, which is not even close to half of what Russia is making per month. And then it says, the production, imports, and consumption framework offers a simple tool for planners to monitor endurance and to design policies that shorten the war. By treating ammunition as a global flow rather than a static stock, military professionals can allocate resources more wisely and avoid strategic surprises. This is obvious. The fact that they have to say this says something about their target audience. These policymakers that work for these corporations whose goal is maximizing profits, not any actual other purpose than that. In this article, it talks about some Ukrainian drone strikes that supposedly hit Russian ammunition factories. They claim tens of thousands of rounds were destroyed in these attacks. And yet by 2026, the same article is talking about Russian ammunition production being higher more now than ever. So they are carrying out these attacks, but they're not disrupting this massive capacity that Russia has. You look at what Russia is doing to Ukraine, the amount of weapons, ammunition, drones, aircraft, bombs, the ground forces, everything that Russia is throwing at Ukraine, and yet Ukraine is still there in one way or another. Yes, it's supported by all of NATO, the United States, and all of its proxies. But how much more damage would you have to do to Russia, which is much larger geographically, and even in terms of industrial infrastructure, much larger, much larger and more spread out than Ukraine? How much more damage would you have to do to Russia to get any sort of result? So you see 2 or 3 attacks here and there on these facilities. Yes, it causes damage. Yes, it raises the cost for the war for Russia, which is one of the primary objectives of the U.S. proxy war against Russia and Ukraine in the first place. But you're not going to fully disrupt military-industrial production this way. You need to expand these attacks many times fold. So what will Western analysts say next? They'll say artillery is outdated, doesn't matter, drones are the future, and that's even hinted in this article. We can use drones to strike at these shell factories and disrupt production, but they haven't done it yet. But then Russia is making many times more drones than the collective West as well. More drones, better drones, cheaper drones. As a matter of fact, I actually have an article coming out about this startup, Anduril, in the United States, and how it's promised to match or exceed Russian and Chinese military production, industrial production, but again, is simply just stealing billions and billions of dollars of taxpayer money that should be used on healthcare, education, infrastructure. And by diverting billions and billions, well, the overall military budget's over $1 trillion now. You're diverting trillions of dollars now away from America, the people in America, things like healthcare, education, infrastructure that they desperately need to have just decent lives. You're taking all of that and you're pouring it down a drain, this drain, where they make these promises. In this case, didn't even deliver anything, literally nothing. They've delivered nothing. And in Anduril's case, as I will show you, missiles and drones that are cheaper than, say, Boeing, Lockheed, and Raytheon, but still more expensive than anything Russia or China is making, and less capable than anything Russia or China is making. And then when you see the misery of the ordinary American people, I am an American. I was watching it slide downhill the entire time I was growing up in the United States. I still have friends and family in the United States telling me how things are going there. The misery that American people are suffering increasingly year to year is because the money that should be spent making things better in the United States is being stolen by these for-profit corporations and wasted. And even if they were taking every single tax dollar and putting it into artillery rounds and missiles, it's to fight wars of aggression abroad rather than taking care of the American people back at home. And what it reveals is that these for-profit corporations, General Dynamics, Anduril, Boeing, Raytheon, and then of course we could say the same for the pharmaceutical industry, the auto industry, big oil, big tech, all of these industries, they are actually making American lives worse, measurably worse, in reality, than they claim Russia, China, and Iran somehow are as some sort of nebulous threat abroad. And again, lies repeated by politicians these very corporations own. So please keep all of that in mind. Again, myself and many other analysts predicted that this would be the outcome. And now we see the mainstream media, the Western media itself, reporting on it. I mean, CBS News is mainstream US-based media, and they are telling you that they took hundreds of millions of dollars and they've wasted it. They didn't keep their promise of what they said they were going to do. And even if they did, how is that promise relevant to the lives, the peace, the security, the stability, the prosperity of the American people at home? Okay, so it's lie upon lie, theft upon theft, war upon war, war abroad against these other nations, and a war of sorts against the American people themselves. I will go over the article that I wrote on Anduril. I will go into that in a future video. If you thought this video was useful,
go figure. Follow me.